Today we sent out a press release announcing that Danielle Williams is our Economic Development Director. She, for the last 2 years, has served as our Executive Director for the Main Street Program and has done an amazing job in increasing investment, creating jobs, and bringing businesses to downtown. And of course, this is exactly the type of passion and energy that we need in order to have a more robust economic development program across the city. She'll begin this new role here later this month, and we'll obviously have a transition program or a transition strategy to transition Main Street to a new Main Street manager. For those that are not familiar, she's been with us since she graduated college, roughly 15 years ago, and she became an assistant director with the Parks Department in 2014 and has been instrumental in a lot of quality of life projects since then. And so the one thing that everything has in common that she's involved with is that it enhances livability, which at the end is our mission. And so we're very excited for her in this new role, as she'll continue to help us do that in a slightly different capacity. But at the end of the day, we're working very intentionally to enhance livability. And so we're excited for her new role. And so if you can help congratulate her, greatly appreciate that. All right.
Does Danielle want to say anything so the public can see what she looks like?
Thank you. Oh, okay. Well, no, I'm super excited to take on this endeavor. And, I've called Victoria home for 12 years now, and I take a lot of pride in that, as do many other Victorians that I've met along the way. And all I've ever wanted to do was just make it better and continue to make it better. So I look forward to this new role and doing just that, making it better. A better place to live. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Awesome. Thank you.
Good job.
And in that same light, we know that there's a lot of different elements that enhance livability, and with that also comes community beautification. And so I also want to briefly mention to you that Krista Euchre, whom you've known as our Keep Victoria Beautiful Coordinator, recently was promoted to Community Appearance Manager as well. She's done an excellent job in almost the 1 year that she's been here in really just ramping up our efforts to keep Victoria beautiful. But as you know, it goes much broader than just that organization. And so in her role as Community Appearance Manager, she'll oversee our operation of that division to a greater degree to hopefully expand the types of projects that she's involved with as well. And so we're very excited that she's chosen us to be her community and her work family. We're very excited for the work that she will bring to the table too in her new role. So congratulations to her as well. Is she here? Okay. All right, so that's what I got under announcements. I can just transition into some of the employee recognitions, if that's all right.
Please.
All right, so first, I want to recognize our city secretary's office. As you know, our city secretary's office routinely receives recognitions, and this is testament to their leadership. Recently, they've been recognized by the Texas Department of State Health Services and received the Exemplary 5-Star Award for excellence in the vital statistics registration process. Award criteria includes training, customer service, security, and software maintenance. Of the 341 local registrar offices in the state, the city secretary's office was one of only 126 to receive the award for 2021. This marks the 19th time the city secretary's office has been recognized and the 9th time to receive the Exemplary Award specifically. And so kudos to April and her team. I hope they're still here.
April's here.
Yes.
April's here. April's here.
Yeah. Yeah, April's here. Yeah, she's in the back. Yeah. So, and Faith's in the back as well. So thank you all so much for your hard work. We really appreciate it.
Great job.
All right. And we also... Did it turn off on me? Oh, okay. We also, as you know, like to recognize our employees that pursue continued education. And so we want to acknowledge the recent master's degree received by Sam Hankins, who's our Communication Public Affairs Communication Specialist. She received the master's degree in Spanish Translation and Interpreting from UTRGV. The program provides instruction in the translation of general and specialized texts from Spanish into English and vice versa. She began working with us in January of 2020. And so we're very excited for that because now I don't have to, I don't have to be the one to do that. Now I have an excuse to say, Sam, aren't you supposed to be able to do this? So thank you so much for your continued education achievement, Sam.
That it?
That's it.
Okay, excellent ones. Close public and employee recognitions and open items from council. We have 2 items already listed. Is there anything else anybody would like to add to it? Okay.
All right. Mayor, normally I think this is the moment where we pull items from consent. And so
Okay.
I do want to announce that staff is pulling item D2.
Okay.
And we're actually pulling it to bring it back at a later meeting. There's some additional information that we'd like to put together for that item.
All right. So we have 2 items on items from council. One is discussion of residential speed limits that Mr. Lofgren brought up, and then mine is discussion of speed humps. And I see these as going kind of hand in hand, and I think it would be beneficial to staff if us as a council can come up with what problem are we trying to solve? And I have an idea in my head already formed because I knew I was going to ask the question. But what are we trying to solve with both of these items?
We're trying to slow people down in neighborhoods.
Trying to slow people down in
And
neighborhoods.
safety, we care about the safety of the people in the neighborhoods.
Right. Does everyone kind of agree with that?
Yeah.
I don't necessarily agree totally with trying to slow people down because I'm more worried about the safety aspect of it, and I don't want them going over the speed limit because in my mind, we have neighborhoods that have become some cut-through, just our organic growth of the city. It happens, right? You might want to bypass the intersection of Navarro and the Loop, and there's different ways to do it through Northcrest, right? Or getting to the school, we've all heard about the stories of, people cutting through to get to the high school at West, and on the East, going through that neighborhood, Carriage Park. So it's happened naturally. It's not a fault of anybody's, but we want to be able to protect those in the neighborhood from traffic that's going through at a clip that's too fast for residential streets. So when I looked at both of these items, and I was like 30 versus 25, if we only did the 25, we're still going to have the same problem because it comes down to enforcement. I don't care if it's 25 or 30. If someone's going 35 on the road, you can't do anything about that without enforcement. And without increasing our department size for the police to beef up the enforcement of residential speed, or speed limits, I think that we don't solve anything by lowering to 25.
Well, I disagree because when I drive, I look at the speed limits and I tend to drive what the speed limit is. So it's like, yes, it's not going to solve everything. And, but if some people drive slower in a neighborhood, it's a safer neighborhood for kids to play and for people to walk in. I passed around the article from Flower Mound because, and I tried to get a hold of people in Flower Mound. Nobody's called me back. But they did lower the speed limit in residential areas. They let neighborhoods vote on it. And about 20% of Flower Mound had lowered the speed limit. And it seemed to be a success because then in November, they lowered all residential speed limits in Flower Mound to 25 miles per hour. And they brought up that it was a safety issue, that if a car is going 25, you're more likely less to be injured than if it's going 30. I understand whatever you put the speed limit, people are going to go a different speed. But some people do obey the speed limit signs. I'm one of them. 30 is too fast for neighborhoods. Yes, it needs to be enforced. And in fact, where it should be enforced is where we have these people cutting through. If it was 25 miles an hour and where people cut through and you had a police officer there, the ticket would be a lot bigger than it was if it was 30 miles an hour. So, 25, it's a safety issue. Have somebody drive 30 miles an hour in front of your house and then have them drive and tell me if you think that that's safe. It's not. We have thoroughfares. We have some thoroughfares that are 30 miles an hour.
thoroughfares that are 30, like Brent,
Placido Benavides right now.
So, I mean, it's like
35.
Placido
residential
Benavides is
areas shouldn't be
35.
thoroughfares.
35, yeah.
Yes.
Residential areas should be, it should, yes, it's not gonna solve the problem. Speed humps aren't gonna solve the problem, but they'll help the problem.
So the speed hump, in my view, is a traffic calming device, is what they're called. And it is the recommended first step when trying to address speeding.
Well, I think I see where you're going with this, because I've got a philosophical problem with us just deciding that we're going to lower speed limits on every residential street, when some of them are not having a problem, and say that it's safety, and say, I don't like the paternalistic approach that Flower Mound took. 20% of the people said that they liked it, so they did that for a while, and then
No,
they said, hey, what's good for the,
No, I think you read the article wrong. It said 20% were at 25%.
okay.
Okay, they let neighborhoods decide to go to 25%.
But then-
And when they went to the 25 for the whole, they left neighborhoods the option of voting to be 30 miles per hour.
Well, so what I'm getting at is that I think I see where you're going, or where I'm going with that, is that we definitely do have a problem with some cut-through streets. And I'd like to see if we could do something about that, because I think the whole neighborhood would appreciate that. But I'm not sure that somebody that's lucky enough not to live on the cut-through street necessarily wants to have the speed limits lowered, in their area also. So that's kind of where I am right now.
Well,
I look at it from the standpoint that, not every residential street is created equal. And, some of them at 30 miles an hour may be safer than others at 30 miles an hour. And so I don't know if a blanket approach is necessarily warranted, but I think certainly I can see where a slower speed limit could lead to safety, but a slower speed limit could also solve some of the cut-through problem from the standpoint that I'd rather stay on the thoroughfare than drive 25 through the neighborhood, and so I see those two things going hand in hand. I like the idea from a safety standpoint in the right scenarios, in the right neighborhoods, but, some streets are wider than others and some more narrow. So I think maybe a more focused approach on some specific problem areas, maybe that's something we look at instead of just a blanket.
And maybe we can do it that neighborhoods get to decide, just like we talked about speed humps, speed bumps. A certain amount of people get to decide. The same process could be used for lowering the speed limit in a neighborhood. And then maybe if people like it, then we'll see what happens. And that's exactly what Flower Mound did. They started out letting people choose. And I think we should let people choose. I don't live in a place where there's a lot of people going fast down my street, but I don't want them going 30 miles an hour down my street either. I remember when Crestwood was done, and people were complaining that people were going too fast, and actually they were going the speed limit. It's just that the road got fixed and they could go 30 miles an hour down the street. So, I mean, it depends on your street. In fact, my neighborhood, the streets are so bad that people probably don't go 30 miles an hour.
That
But
is
when-
an
but when-
effective and cost-effective way to slow
Yes,
traffic.
It's not the way I like, but it does work. But if the streets get fixed, I don't want the people speeding down the street at 30 miles per hour. So I think it would be nice, just like speed humps and speed bumps, that at least neighborhoods should have the option of going to 25 miles per hour.
Well, since we have brought this up and we've talked about this publicly, I have not had a single person call me and tell me that they'd like their street speed limit lowered, and I take a,
have.
okay. I kind of, has
I
anybody else?
haven't, in the 8.5 years I've been on council, I haven't had anybody ask me that, and I haven't had anybody since the workshop where we brought this up say, that's awesome, that's exactly what we need. And
Ask them now that we're discussing it, what they think of it. If somebody doesn't bring up something, they probably don't think that we could have changed it to 25 miles per hour, or it never entered their mind. But ask them now that we're discussing it, how they feel about it.
Didn't the state try to pass something to go to 25 mile per hour on residential streets?
I had brought this up twice, and I got the impression that we couldn't lower it to 25 miles per hour. But then when I got this article that Andrew was nice enough to send me, and I hope he feels better, obviously you can lower the speed limit in residential areas to 25 miles per hour, so
Or at least temporarily until you get caught.
something like that. And maybe they could maybe the city staff could clarify that.
I have a question. At the beginning of the discussion, you said the staff. So are you asking the staff to look into what areas are the problem areas before we go any further? Or are we just gonna pick some? So how would you propose to do this then?
Just like speed bumps or speed humps, I think neighborhoods should have the right to lower the speed limit to 25 miles per hour.
Okay, so how do you pick the streets if it's not with?
We don't pick the streets, the neighborhoods pick the streets.
Well, I understand that, but the eventual outcome would have to come with the staff because they were the ones that, I know we would approve it, but still, we need data to prove or to sustain that.
Why? If a neighborhood wants to go to 25 miles per hour, why do we need data to prove that?
What if they want to go to 35?
Well, I'm not interested in raising the speed limit. If you want to put that option in there, that's up to you. The whole object is to give neighborhoods the option to be safer. And being safer it's not just speed humps, it's lowering the speed limit. And they should have that option. If you want to put it on the May ballot and ask the citizens, I'd be fine with that. But I think neighborhoods should have the option. They don't have to go to it. They can leave it the way it is. But if Crestwood decides that the people that live in that area, that street is too fast at 30 miles per hour.
It's not a residential street.
Well, and that's something.
That's not a residential
Okay,
street,
and-
so it doesn't even qualify.
Okay, and you're right. But if a neighborhood decides that it's too fast, they should have the ability, just like to get a speed hump.
Would you
Why
take it?
not? Why should they not have the ability to lower the speed limit in their neighborhood?
And would you do it per neighborhood, or would you allow them to choose streets in the program that you're proposing?
Well, and that's something city staff's gonna have to work out, just like speed humps. They came up with a policy. We're gonna have to come up with a policy. I'm not gonna write the policy. They're gonna write the policy.
Well, I mean, which,
And
in
then
your
we can
vision,
have input into it.
but in your vision, which would you do? Would you do it street by
Well,
street, or would you do it?
No.
The neighborhood
It would
as
be neighborhoods.
neighborhoods? Okay.
Because street by street would not, I don't think would work. And every neighborhood is different. But right now, we have signs going in neighborhoods that say 30 miles per hour, okay? If you want to change what it is in the neighborhood, you change the signs to 25 miles per hour. But shouldn't neighborhoods have the ability to do that? If they have the ability to put a speed hump or speed bump or whatever in there, shouldn't they have the ability to lower the speed limit?
But the speed hump policy also has criteria in there that relates to people going over the speed limit.
Refresh our memory.
So, and I'm sorry, that's in my briefcase in my truck, but in the policy.
Ken knows it by memory. He can stand up and verbalize it.
It has to have so much traffic per day right now, which I'm not sure what the right number is on that for our community. And then a certain percentage of the cars that travel on that road have to be traveling more than 5 miles per hour over the speed limit before it would qualify. Is that,
I don't want to put, okay, as far as speed limit, it should just be up to the neighborhood. It doesn't matter how many cars go through the neighborhood. It doesn't matter what the cars look like, what make they are. The neighborhood should be able to decide if they want to lower their speed limit to 25. I think that's only, I don't see anything wrong with that. Why shouldn't neighborhoods have that? Tell me, somebody explain to me why a neighborhood, and in Flower Mound, it has to be 2/3 of the people, okay? You can decide whatever number you want, but a neighborhood should have that right.
And then they would be able to raise it also. I mean, I'm kind of envisioning, I'm envisioning
You're getting in the weeds now.
Well-
Let's just deal with if they want to lower it to 25.
but I'm serious.
If they want to go back to 30, then they could, if 2/3 could say that they want to go back to 30. But let's just deal with the idea that a neighborhood has the option to go to 25 miles per hour.
What's the cost implication?
What?
What's the cost?
Yeah, those are elements that we could, figure out, right?
Pay the cost.
Part of what we hope comes out of this conversation is some clear direction from what the majority of council would like to see so that we can put something together, right? That is at least based off of some, even if it's like this, right, some direction to go in a path. So for example, if the consensus is neighborhoods, okay, well, we can put some thought into that, right? I don't think it's as easy as saying neighborhoods because there's plenty of streets in our community that, go ask people in our community what neighborhood they're a part of. They wouldn't be able to tell you, right? And so just right off the bat, how do you define neighborhoods? Who defines the neighborhood? Is it the residents by saying it starts here, ends here, right? I mean, there's things that would have to be figured out if we wanted to take a neighborhood approach to it. But if there's a community that already does it, we can reach out to them and say, hey, what's your policy? How did you tackle it? And just learn more about it just in terms of research. But, if that's the direction from council, that's what we'll do.
King Gill, aren't most changes in speed limits or street design or street changes, isn't all that data-driven?
Yes, basically it is. It's a lot of the streets that you have, arterial collectors, the speed is based on the design of that road. In other words, the curves, the dimensions, how it's built. So that's a correct response. Answer.
So having a neighborhood that has one street that's a cut-through street or just a straightaway where most vehicles speed, doesn't mean that you would have to have the whole neighborhood decrease to 20, but maybe that one road, correct?
Right. And there are some neighborhoods that, due to the width of the street, the
Amount of cars
distance
parking.
and cars parked, but the distance between blocks, you can't get to 30 miles an hour in that short, a 600-foot dead-end cul-de-sac. A lot of design elements are now going towards designing neighborhoods to keep that speed reduced naturally. A good example is you got the streets of old that are 37 foot wide. That's a wide street, and the speed that people travel, it's how comfortable they feel driving down that road.
So in a roundabout way, changes are made in speed limits, street designs, law enforcement presence are data-driven now because the more complaints, the more we pay attention to that
Right.
street. So if it was a blanket thing with all neighborhoods, I mean, every neighborhood in the city of Victoria would be reduced to 25 miles per hour. But if it's selected on complaints or data, we already have that.
We may not have the exact speed limits on some of these streets. In other words, exactly what the people are going. We can put out those devices to collect the data for the streets to see what are the actual speeds on those cars coming through. Collect 7 days one way, 7 days another way. And then that gives you the data to find out is speeding or what are the speeds on that street.
Ken, isn't it true that 80% of the people go the proper speed limit? It's just the extra 20% that we're worried about.
That's what we found on Crestwood, exactly. We found about 85% of the people within that 30 to 33. And you have a certain few that will go over the speed limit, no matter signage or anything else, then it becomes an enforcement type issue.
And that goes to my point. If 80% of the people go the speed limit and you lower the speed limit, and somebody gets hit by a car going 25 instead of going 30, they're more likely to survive or be less injured than if it was 30 miles per hour. Neighborhoods should have the opportunity. They can figure it out. Flower Mound figured out how to do neighborhoods. Our city staff can figure it out. But neighborhoods should have the ability to do it. A lot of things change traffic patterns. My neighborhood, for example, when they put the median in, it stopped people from cutting through on King Arthur. Although there's so many potholes that pretty much slowed them down anyway. But if they fix the streets in Castle Hills West, cars will go faster, and they may even cut through on King Arthur now. And the neighborhood should have the ability to decide if they want to lower the speed limit to 25. When I first got on city council, people on King Arthur, when I was walking streets, a lot of their cars got run into if they were parked on the street because there's a curve and the people were going too fast around the curve and they would hit their truck. Lower speed limits are safer for neighborhoods, and neighborhoods should get to decide that. That's all I want to do. Just like now speed humps and speed bumps are a little bit different because a lot of traffic's cutting through there, and that's why we want to do measurements to make sure that they really need one. But if 5 people go through a neighborhood and they're going through at 30 miles an hour and people want them to go slower, I think the neighborhood should be able to decide that. And yes, it costs to change the signs. It's worth it if it saves a child or if it saves an old person walking their dog. Neighborhoods should be able to decide if they want to lower their speed limit to 25. If nobody does it, fine, but they have the option.
I have to agree with Mark that he's correct. The lower speed limits do save lives. I have years of experience in that. However, I do not believe this should be a blanket policy or situation. I think it ought to be data-driven, and it appears that we're all over the board. I'd like to table this until we can get further information from Ken Gill, from city manager, from city attorney, on how this would be implemented, the cost. I think we're just we're too far off base.
Yeah.
I'd like to table it.
I second it.
Okay, not just table it, but to continue the discussion,
Right,
right?
right.
We've gone 20 minutes on it.
Yeah.
That's good.
I just have one question, Jeff.
Yes.
Mr. Bognight. If we go with reducing the speed limit, are you also going to want the speed bumps in? Is it going to go hand in hand together, or is it one or the other?
It can be one or the other or both.
Should be both.
I certainly don't, I am not in favor of the city saying we're going to reduce speed limits. I can support the concept of the neighborhoods being able to decide, and I liked the concept, the way it was presented to us with the speed humps, where it is neighborhood-driven. It's not the city saying, hey, we're going to lower your speed limit, let us know if you disagree. It's totally neighborhood-driven. We do have a lot of neighborhoods that have homeowners associations, which makes it fairly easy for them if they want to make that change. I know some of the older neighborhoods, it'd be a little more difficult, but I can see it being put into the speed hump policy, maybe the two of them together.
So one data point that I would like is on residential streets, how many incident reports do we have of someone getting hit?
Or vehicle damage.
Yeah, but you don't get incident reports on how many people got out of the way of the car. And I'll give you an example. On my street, the kids play in the street. Okay, if a car is
Okay.
going 30 miles an hour down the street, it's a lot harder to get out of the way.
Well, we do know.
And the neighborhood should get to decide that. It doesn't have anything to do with how many people. The neighborhood should get to decide if they want to lower their speed limit. If they don't, they don't have to.
I don't think I'd use that example again
No,
of kids playing in the street. but-
That's kind of I remember that from Planning Commission. Don't build any more houses. My children play in the street. It just, not a good argument.
My argument is the faster a car goes, the more likely somebody is going to get hurt more seriously. And neighborhoods should be able to decide if they want to lower the speed limit to 25. I don't understand why anybody would object to the neighborhood voting to lower their speed limit. I don't understand that. But that's all.
I think my concern, the general concept, I don't disagree with you on. I want to see how it's implemented because devil being in the details.
Sure.
I think really that's going to determine whether or not this is really going to be an effective policy for the city is what does the implementation look like? So I'm holding off on any kind of
So,
broad
Mr.
decision
Lofgren,
until I
would
see
you be okay
that.
just working with staff to try and
Sure,
craft something that has a little bit more of those details?
sure.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'm going to skip any further discussion right now on speed humps, just from items from council going a while on that one. So if there are no other items from council, we're going to go to citizens' communication. I have one individual tonight, Mr. Michael Vonderon.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, Mayor Pro Tem, Executive Secretary. Well, a lot of people don't give the Executive Secretary credit. I think I'm the first one to ever do it. But anyway, I just, everyone talks about keep Victoria beautiful. Some people don't want to keep it beautiful, and that's when code enforcement comes in handy, to cite them, to force them to keep it beautiful against their wishes so they don't have to pay a fine, and they made some rounds through the trailer park, and they got 2 abandoned cars taken care of, and those 2 mattresses on Family Dollar were finally picked up. I don't know if you remember those pictures. They had 3 mattresses. And happy belated Martin Luther King's Day. He had a dream, and it was to get the civil rights passed in 1964. And I have a dream, and it's to get an animal trap to catch that pit bull on 2203. I've been trying for 4 weeks, unsuccessful, and went through the commissioner's court, still unsuccessful. But I'm not giving up, And if someone could help me get a trap, I would appreciate it very much. This pit bull goes around terrorizing all the loose dogs, and the people don't obey laws. Only the government can solve the problem. They believe dogs should not have a leash, or they'll put a leash, but they don't walk the dog. So you see stray dogs with leashes all over the place, and it's getting out of hand. And so far, the commissioner's court or animal control has not helped, but I haven't gave up. And anyway, thanks, and have a good day. And I would like to thank the executive secretary for all the work she does. Appreciate it. Thanks. Have a good evening.
Thank you. I forgot to recognize someone. Got Mr. Blanchard from the head of the Victoria Sales Tax Development Corporation here. Good evening. Did you have anything for us tonight? No? Okay, great. Glad you're here. So with that, we're going to close citizens' communication and go into items with public hearing. We have one item.
Item C1 is an ordinance amending and readopting traffic regulation schedules as provided in various sections of city code.
Good evening. I'm here to talk about raising the speed limits versus lowering them. This is for Placido Benavides.
And Ken, who was the one who wanted to raise the speed limit? Who was the one that brought this? Thank you.
You brought it up, boy. I've had questions about it before. Anyway,
Nobody
basically,
plays in that street.
the
huh?
wording describes from Navarro up to the concrete portion will remain 35. There's a reason being there's a lot of driveways, a lot of conflict points in that section, and it makes good traffic sense. From the concrete section all the way up to the curve will be increased to 40, which we talked about and going through it about what is the right speed limit. Is 40 is a comfortable drive because there is the sidewalk that is adjacent to that street. Getting it faster than that, it starts getting a little uncomfortable for the pedestrians walking along that street and even for the driver. So we've increased it to 40 in that section from 35, and then around the curve, up to where Salem intersects is 35, and then all the way on Salem, all the way to the loop is 35. And then the other section, do I have any questions on that piece? Okay, the other one is, as I was going through the ordinance, noticed a section that had a decreased speed limit for Business 59, basically from East Street all the way to Stoner. It had 20 miles an hour for the center turn lane. Well, now that TxDOT is putting median in, there's no reason to have that section in there. And when you go looking at trying to enforce that, there's no way to sign it. There's no way to really enforce that. And that is a situation with all center turn lanes. You want to do the speed that is a safe movement type speed. So wanted to remove that mainly because of the median.
The median's not in yet, though. It's still going to be several months before it's in.
Right. But right now, there's no way to sign it. In other words, where do I put a sign that says 20 miles an hour inside a center turn lane?
Except it never was signed, was it?
Never was signed. It never was in there. I believe that was an old section.
I'm just, Because
Yes, it doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make sense.
No, but I always
It's
knew that it was supposed to be slower in the center lane, in the turn lane. I don't know how I knew that, though.
It's just what's comfortable and safe. If you get into an accident, they're going to put unsafe speed.
Well, if you're in the middle turn lane, you're supposed to be in it to slow down the turn.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Not speed up and get into the
Yeah.
traffic.
Exactly.
That's my only question, though. Is that going to create any type of an enforcement problem for us? Because it's not completed yet, and so we do have that center turn lane.
Right. I don't think so.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Gill.
The construction's slowing us down.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to open up item C1's public hearing. Anybody wishing to speak on this item, please step up to the front mic. Seeing no one jump up, we'll close the public hearing and entertain any motions.
So moved.
Second.
We got a motion and a second to approve item C1. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Thank you. On to the consent agenda without D2.
Item D1 is the adoption of minutes of the regular meeting of the January 4th, 2022, the special meeting on January 7th, 2022, and the special meeting on January 10th, 2022. Item D3 is a resolution approving the purchase of a 2022 Dodge Ram 5500 Type 1 ambulance from Siddons Martin Emergency Group LLC in the amount of $299,731. And item D4 is a resolution approving the purchase of a 350 horsepower motor for the vertical turbine pump from Bradley's Incorporated for the surface water treatment plant for their proposal amount of $88,925.20.
Move.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Item E1. And if it's all right with y'all, there's a presentation that Mr. Etienne has for items E1, 2, 3, and 4. And after he's done and we have our discussion, or if y'all are all right voting on
That's fine.
items in one single vote, I'd appreciate a motion in that manner.
Okay, so I'll read all four. Item E1 is a resolution supporting an affordable multifamily senior housing tax credit development located at 2513 North Navarro, requested by Fish Pond Development LLC. Item E2 is a resolution supporting an affordable multifamily senior housing tax credit development located at 108 Primrose Street and 702 Bingham Road, requested by the Commonwealth Companies. Item E3 is a resolution supporting an affordable multifamily senior housing tax credit development located at 901 North John Spackbauer Drive, requested by Real Text Development Corporation. And item E4 is a resolution supporting an affordable senior multifamily housing tax credit development located at the southwest corner of the intersection of Zach Lentz Parkway and Millette Drive, requested by KCG Development Incorporated, Development LLC, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, and good evening, Mayor and Council. So with this presentation, staff is recommending approval of the of resolutions of support for 4 projects that are being submitted to the state Department of Housing and Community Affairs for the 9% tax credit. As a background, Mayor and Council, TDHCA, which stands for the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, essentially allocates tax credits, and the tax credits are the primary way to construct or finance affordable housing. In other words, it's extremely difficult to finance affordable workforce housing today without tax credits, and that's nationally. So the tax credits are essentially allocated by U.S. Treasury to the state, and then the state allocates the tax credits or awards the tax credits to the developers, who in turn sell the tax credits in exchange for building affordable housing. There are two types of tax credits. You have the competitive 9% tax credits program, and you have the non-competitive tax credit program. So you ask, well, Mike, what is the difference between the two? Well, the 9% tax credit is extremely competitive. So the applicants or the applications are awarded based on regional allocation, whereas the 4% tax credit is not competitive, and the applications are scored, they are scored and taken throughout the year. And the award is based on the availability of private activity bonds. So the Housing Finance Corporation, the projects that we did with the Enchanted Gardens and the Odom Street, those two projects were done through the 4% housing tax credits. So the 9% tax credits are, the applications are taken once a year, and they are scored and ranked within the region or regionally. The projects are financed through tax credits and conventional loans. That's how the 9% are financed. Whereas the 4%, they are financed through tax credits, conventional loans, and the private activity bonds that are issued by the HFCs or PFCs. So the Enchanted Gardens project, and of course the proposed Odom Street, is financed through the private activity bonds, tax credits, and conventional loans. The 9% tax credit provides at least 70% of the developer's equity. That's why it's so competitive. That's why every developer wants the 9%, because it provides 70% of the total finance cost for the project. Whereas the 4%, only 30%. It's not as lucrative. So again, to make the 4% work, you have to work with a housing finance corporation like ours. The state divides, the TDHCA divides the state into regions. We have 13 regions. These are tax credit regions that developers compete in. And Victoria is in Region 10. And Region 10 consists of Corpus Christi, Victoria, and a couple other communities. We have not received a 9% housing tax credit deal or project since 2007. You say, well, why is that? It's because the way the applications are scored through the qualified allocation plan, it essentially provides more points to projects that are in larger cities. So because a city has larger population, they get more points. Also higher job density, they get more points, which is really punitive to smaller cities like Victoria or more rural communities, because we don't have a large population and we also don't have the high job density. So realizing that, the city manager and I went to Austin. We met with the director of TDHCA to bring that forward, to say, how can smaller cities like Victoria be more competitive when it comes to the 9% tax credits? So we looked at different options, and one thing that was done this year in terms of change to the QAP was that they agreed to essentially extend the job density from 1 mile to 2 to 4 miles. So essentially, it makes it more competitive for rural communities or cities like us, where because we don't have the high job density. So what it says is that if you have a housing project within a mile of that project, you should have jobs. So what we did is we said, well, that's fine, but can you make it 2 to 4 miles? And because of that, it makes us a little bit more competitive. So thank you, Jesus, for going to the state to essentially lobby for the smaller communities.
And Mike, I'm going to briefly jump in. That's a work in progress. We recognize that there's more work to be done to have communities like ours or Kingsville, where I was before, more competitive. But before you start talking about the 4, really quickly as a refresher, 2 years ago, we worked with Realtex to submit a 9% for also senior project in the land that ended up being Enchanted Gardens. That project, we worked closely with the developer to try and maximize points, and we lost out to Corpus by literally 1 point. And so just keep that in mind, that even in the best of scenarios, as much as we could, we lost out to Corpus by 1 point. We're hopeful that with this minor tweak in the QAP, we could be more competitive and at least tie with Corpus or do something like that to where we can go into some kind of tie-break formula that provides some discretion. But just keep that in mind. And we very intentionally wanted to include this in the presentation to manage expectations with the public and everybody involved, that this is very competitive process and it's not guaranteed.
Do we have a higher chance of maybe getting one of these now that we have 4 applying for the?
Well, we
Same.
actually have a better chance actually having more because each will be scored individually,
Okay.
right? And so each will be receiving its own score. So the more that we have, hopefully one of these, scores very well, right? And each will score differently because of their location and this, radius element, right? And a couple of other factors too that are site specific. But every one of these developers very intentionally chooses a site that their internal research conveys to them that this project will be competitive. And each company is different in their methodology on how they develop and find sites that they deem competitive. And so all of these projects, have picked all of these sites because their own internal staff research has indicated to them that this site is competitive.
Right.
Okay,
So the more we have submitting, in essence,
the better chance?
the better chance we have of at least one of them. 2 years ago, for example, when the Realtex project, was 1 point away, I think that was the only one that we had
That's the only one.
that year. And this year we have these 4, and we know a 5th one's coming on February 1st, maybe a 6th one. So we might have up to total of 6 being submitted this year. So that's a significant
Is that in
difference.
July, or what month was it?
He has a timeline
Oh, okay.
slide that he'll go through
Have
here in
the
a second.
timeline.
And Mike, speed through these, please.
Sure. So this year, we have 4 that we're presenting today, but as Jesus mentioned, we do have another developer that is also requesting the resolution of support, and we will bring that next council meeting. So this map shows the location of the 4 proposed developments. They are all senior housing. Senior housing is essentially housing for individuals who are 55 and over. The units are geared primarily for those making 60% or less of the area median income, which means that the individual cannot make more than $30,300 per year. So the goal, again, is to bring affordable housing to the community. And affordable housing essentially is where the renter does not spend more than 30% of his or her income towards housing. And again, in order to be competitive, the developer has to receive a resolution of support from City Council, as well as the $500 waiver in building permit fees. So next slide, I will go through each of the developments. So some of the developers are here in case you have additional questions. So the first project is called Fish Pond at Victoria. The location is 2513 Navarro Street. It's essentially adjacent to Shipley's Donuts on Navarro. The developer is Fish Pond LLC from Austin. They're looking at constructing about 100 units, 4 stories, with elevators, 1 to 2 bedrooms.
Can I ask you about this one in particular?
Sure.
Isn't that piece of property in a historic district? And as such, could this even be built there?
Mm,
I don't believe College Park is a historic district. We have
Yes, it
Nine
is.
Rivers, is it physical? But our only prohibition on historic districts is no manufactured homes. We don't have a prohibition on multifamily.
Okay.
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that's the first project. The second one is the Commons on Primrose. The address is 108 Primrose. You might know this site because this is the back parcel of the Del Norte project. It's directly across from Lowe's and Hobby Lobby. So the developer is Commonwealth Companies out of Wisconsin, from Wisconsin. They plan to build 60 units, again, senior community, about 30 one-bedrooms and 30 two-bedroom units. The third one is the Victorian, and the address is 901 North John Stockbauer Drive. Developers Realtex Development Corporation. Realtex is the developer that's building the Enchanted Gardens. And the development will have 96 units, 1 bedroom and 2 bedrooms, 4 stories high, elevator, and so forth. And the address is, again, 901 North John Stockbauer, across from Colony Creek. And the fourth one is the Nave Lending. And the address is at the, specifically at the southwest corner of the intersection of Zach Lenz and Millette. So it's adjacent to the area apartments. Developer is KCG Development LLC from Austin. Developer plans to build 90 units, 1 and 2 bedrooms, about 3-4 stories high. In regards to the timeline, so the developers were required to submit their pre-application to the state on January 7th. This is just to see where they score, to see if they would be competitive. And then today, January, February, so today we are, City Council will hopefully pass or approve the resolution of support, and that gives the developer 17 points. Again, this is very competitive, and it's all points driven. So they get 17 points for receiving the resolution of support from council. So on March 1st, the full application is due to TDHCA. And that includes all the letters of support, architectural plans, financials, charts, organizational charts, etc. So March 1st is the drop dead date for them to submit their full application. So if all goes well, TDHCA will announce the awards in July. And then October, December, the developer would close on the property and would take about a year or so to start construction. So one of the questions that I've received is that can the HFC, the Victoria Housing Finance Corporation, do a 4% deal for senior housing? And the answer is yes, the HFC can facilitate the development of a senior housing. However, it would be much more expensive than the 9%, which means that the HFC would have to be a partner, probably for the tax exemption. Also, the developer most likely would require that the HFC put in some soft costs to make the project work. So it's more expensive to do 4% deals than it would for 9%. But nonetheless, the HFC can do a senior housing deal using the 4% tax credit, except it's more expensive, more subsidy required. So with this presentation, Mayor and Council, so we are asking for approval of the resolution of support for those 4 developers who are submitting applications to the state for senior housing in Victoria. Again, it's very competitive. We hope to get it, but it's still a very, very competitive process. And we are hopeful that we'll get one because we haven't gotten a 9% deal since 2007. So,
Thank you, Mr. Etienne.
I move we adopt E1, 2, 3, and 4 as presented.
Second it.
Right, is there any further comments? Keep your fingers crossed.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get 1, 2, 3, or 4, and 4.
Yep. All right, all those in favor of E1 through 4, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, the same sign. All action items pass. That closes action items, and we're into a city manager report, and then a work session, and then an executive session, so.
So we'll be here
Ms.
till
Folder?
9. Just kidding.
Did you
My
bring supper?
presentation's not that
Huh?
long, I promise.
Did you bring dinner?
Dinner? Yeah. We got Chick-fil-A on its way.
All right.
So, good evening. I'm here to give a brief presentation about code enforcement. So this is Development Services' mission statement. As you can see, we strive to provide sound professional advice and technical expertise, apply codes fairly and consistently, and have a duty to enforce city codes to ensure a safe and healthy environment, which of course is most applicable to our code enforcement division. So, as you can see from the pictures, code enforcement is very important to neighborhoods, to citizens. The before and afters really, I think, almost tell the story itself. So our code enforcement division is made up of 5 full-time employees. Grace Garcia is our code enforcement supervisor. And then we have 4 officers, 2 senior, a code enforcement officer 2, and a code enforcement officer 1. So those are actually the 5 full-time employees that are in the code enforcement division. But then, of course, Rick Madrid, our chief building official and assistant director, provides oversight, as well as myself. And then we have assistants from Denise Beyer. She does all of the code call takes from and provides that administrative support. We also have our planning technician help out with contracts. So even though there's only 5 full-time in the code enforcement division, Development Services is a large department with a lot of team effort. So our budget has remained relatively stable over the last several years. This last fiscal year, we had $125,000 budgeted for contract budget, which is abatements, and then $110,000 for demolition. At the end of the year, we sometimes move those around as we realize we maybe won't get the last Building Standard Commission contracts in place, and we run out of contract money. So we always end up doing some budget amendments. Sometimes it's the other way. We have a little extra contract money because we've been focusing on demos, and so we push them to demos. But we always do spend all of that money. So this is our complaint history since 2017. I will kind of cover why they changed so drastically in 2021. But as you can see, our environmental nuisance complaint numbers went down, but we increased in all of our other types of cases that the division worked. And that change is because at the beginning of fiscal year 2021, we made a split in our department. And we had 2 code enforcement officers dedicated solely to substandard buildings, property maintenance, and municipal court cases, which is our repeat offenders. And then we had 2 code enforcement officers that just worked the nuisance abatements because they're very different animals, and I'll go through the processes for each of those. But as you can imagine, substandard building, property maintenance type cases, municipal court cases are a lot more involved than weedy lots and junk lots. We focus on priority areas, our main thoroughfares for nuisance abatements, and then for our substandard buildings and property maintenance, we've been focusing on our area just east of downtown up to Queen City. We also worked with the police department. We were getting a lot of calls about abandoned vehicles in the right-of-way. I think they'd put that activity on hold during COVID, but they have since brought that back. We also, it's really unrelated to Habitat, to code enforcement, but it's in our department, and I think it really has an impact on neighborhood stability and revitalization, which is what we really, tied closely with the work that code enforcement is doing, but with our CDBG funds, we entered into that habitat partnership to revitalize homes, provide roofs and critical repairs. And so we imagine that as we move forward, and if that's program successful and we can allocate more CDBG funds, currently a lot of our, for example, CDB demo cases come through code enforcement. So there's a lot of coordination between those two divisions just because of the type of work that our code enforcement does. And then we also eliminated our second postcard notice to repeat violators and the time associated with that notice, and I'll get into that a little bit later.
Julie, real quick, I want to interject a thought here. Can you go back one slide? So part of the change in the structure is that change in philosophy is important, right? I mean, we believe in the broken windows theory, right, which suggests that if you have, literally a rundown structure, it's just going to foster more crime and more issues, right? And so it was a very intentional decision to restructure the division to create more substandard structure complaints with the thought that addressing more of those would be truly more transformational to the neighborhood than just doing a bunch of the weedy lot liens, as an example, right? Hence the program that we're working with the Housing Finance Corporation that we'll bring back as a city manager's report in the near future, because it's really those transformational elements that will truly transform a neighborhood, not simply just, the weedy lot issue, right? So that was a very intentional decision because of how we view neighborhood revitalization. So just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, how many times have you mowed your yard on Sunday and then the next week your neighbors fall like dominoes, and now a week later y'all have a beautiful street because everybody took care of their yards? It's that theory's everywhere. So this is what we have been focusing on. So this is just a case, a property maintenance case. But if you notice, it was opened by Isaac Solis, one of our senior officers, in January of last year, and not closed until November. So this is why we have, such a decline in our nuisance cases, because these are the types of cases that we're trying to work on. Fortunately, they're not easy. They're not easily abated in 7 to 10 days. It takes a while, but these are the types of things that, as Jesus said, are transformative to a neighborhood. So the name of the game in code enforcement is notifications. If we don't properly notice, then that rundown, broken, cracked cooler in someone's yard all of a sudden became, great-grandfather's antique cooler, and, we get in a lot of trouble. So we make sure that our procedures and notices are, the best that they can be, and following all of our laws, city codes plus state laws. There's a lot of notice requirements. You don't even want to know code enforcement's postage budget compared to all of my other divisions because of the notices. But, our first goal is voluntary compliance, and that is just where the officer usually tries to make contact with the homeowner. They knock on the door if nobody's home. If they can't, have that personal interaction, they'll leave a door tag. Those notices don't legally count, but they are the most important notices in our code enforcement officers' eyes, because that's where they get the whole story and they can really, find out what's going on. And our officers also are really reasonable. If someone comes and say, I broke my leg, so I'm having a hard time mowing my yard, I don't know that I'll get it done in 7 days, they'll work with people. Especially if it's your first time as a first-time violator. They also are the best at calling people out. Well, I mean, you heard that sob story 10 times, so no, there's no leniency anymore. But they do work on voluntary compliance. The first official notice is, a letter we send certified generally, and if the property owner does not then fix the violation, then we move on towards abatement, where the city actually pays for the work to be, the grass to be mowed or whatever abatement activity, and then we'll bill the property owner. And then we also use municipal court for some cases. Those are really repeat violators, or a little bit more difficult cases, are things such as like signs. They're getting to use municipal court more and more, especially as we become a court of record. We had our first administrative warrant last week. It's really exciting. So we're continuing to explore what municipal court can do for us, especially now that it's changed to a court of record, because now it can do a lot more. So our most common types of nuisances, of course, are environmental nuisances. This section of code applies to high weeds and grass and junk and debris, but it basically just says it shall be the duty of any owner to cause or to cut or cause to be cut and remove such brush, weeds, debris, trash, junk, stagnant water, and alleviate conditions that may cause disease. For this section, property owners have 7 days to abate. If we provide notice, and whether the property owner abates or we abate, if there is a second violation within a year of that notice, we don't have to provide a second notice. And so that's the postcard that we used to send out as a second notice saying, hey, we already noticed you once, you're in violation, we're going to contract your property. If you don't take care of it, we've eliminated that. And so property, if it gets bad enough, we'll just go and abate. When we talked about how could we eliminate the time on abatements, and the officers brought up the idea of eliminating that second postcard, it kind of gave me a little heartburn. But then I realized these are repeat violators that, they're continuing to cause this work for code enforcement and continuing to be a blight on their neighborhood. And so they convinced me of it. And then, of course, we send a lot of the properties that have so much junk that they're so costly to abate. We'll send them to municipal court, and then those repeat violators. So another popular activity is junked vehicles. A lot of people, I think, don't understand all that goes into the junk vehicle laws. These are basically our code. Follows Chapter 683 of the Texas Transportation Code, which requires us to provide notice to not only the vehicle owner, but also the property owner, which the vehicle is located, and then any lien holder on record. The owner does have an option to request a hearing from the Director of Development Services, and which will determine if it's a nuisance. And then junk vehicles must be sent to a scrapyard and demolished. They cannot be put back onto the road. So the definition of a junked vehicle is actually a little surprising, I think, for most people too, because it's not just a matter of expired tags. It's an and, not an or. So a junked vehicle means that a vehicle that is self-propelled and does not have lawfully attached to it an expired license plate and a valid motor vehicle inspection certificate, and is wrecked, dismantled, or partially dismantled, or discarded, or inoperable, and has remained inoperable for more than 72 consecutive hours if on public property, or 30 consecutive days if on private property. So when our officers go out, or they meet with property owners about junk vehicles, the property or the vehicle owner just has to prove that it's operable. So even if it doesn't have, even if it has expired tags, no inspection, as long as it's operable, it doesn't meet the definition of a junk vehicle. And I know officers have gone out before to see vehicle owners putting in a battery to make sure it works, so that when the officer gets there, they can just have to back it out of the driveway, back it back in, just make it operable for a few feet to prove that it's operable, and then it's not a junk vehicle.
So do y'all have any questions on that? We'll give Julie a moment to catch her breath too.
In that portion of code, does it have a definition of operable? Is it just mechanically? Is it all the blinkers, the taillights, the headlights? What portion is supposed to be operable?
We'll have to research what that definition is, but how we've always enforced it is if it just can propel itself and drive.
It's not the
Maybe the
same
motor
as the
has to turn?
full-fledged safety inspection that a vehicle has to go through. It's a much lower standard.
If you just take it from the drive, or if it's parked out in the street, and you just move it to the driveway, does that constitute them, being not in violation anymore?
I mean, the code enforcement officer has to believe that it's being, operated. So I think if, where gravity were to come into play, or they just put it in reverse and it rolls out, they don't count that. And they actually do have to, see the vehicle being, propelled or operated on its own. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to drive, to the south side of town or north side of town and back.
Motor has to start?
Mm-hmm.
They can't push it.
But you couldn't just tow it
No, it has to,
from
the
the
motor
front.
has to start. You
Yeah.
have to start it up and actually put it in gear and move it.
So it's not just a question of we don't want them on the street. We don't want them in the front yards either if they're not capable of operating.
Right. So we get a lot of calls about vehicles or trailers abandoned in the right-of-way. Again, we go back to Chapter 683 of the Texas Transportation Code, and that actually requires a licensed peace officer to work those. And so we get, like I said, get a lot of calls, and we will refer them to both the call the Victoria Police Department's non-emergency number, and then also the Victoria Sheriff's Office any licensed peace officer can work those types of cases.
What's the definition of an abandoned vehicle? I mean, I understand the junk vehicle, but.
It's in there, 72 hours.
72 hours?
So again, vehicles proven operable, ugly vehicles don't count, even if they're, have expired tags.
Why 72 hours? 683 is 48 hours.
Is it 48? Sorry. The junk vehicle is 72 hours.
So abandoned is 48.
I actually think I pasted that somewhere.
If it's more than, it says right here, it's inoperable, is more than 5 years old, and has been left unattended on public property for more than 48 hours.
And I'm not as
That's the junk.
That's abandoned motor vehicles, section 683.002.
abandoned on the public right-of-way for 48 hours.
But what you read said private property, didn't it?
Public property.
And the other was trailers, like, I'm thinking about something that doesn't drive by itself, just a trailer to haul stuff. If that's parked on the street for more than 48 hours, that's also considered abandoned.
That's my understanding. Of course, code enforcement, we don't work those on the street, so I'm not well versed in what those
The
rules
chief,
are.
yeah, chief is here. He's hiding in the back because he didn't want to come up to talk about it, but he's going to have to come up.
If we hear it's in the street, we ask him to call the sheriff's office or the non-emergency line.
No, I had a question. I had someone ask me about some trailers.
And Mark's here to also help him.
Yeah, I was trying to make myself real small, but look at me. It's not easy to be small. So what I'm looking at our policy and speaking with Julie on occasion, we work well together, is that when we get the call on an abandoned vehicle or a stored vehicle, we initially put a orange sticker on it, advising the owner that it is in violation. And then within 24 hours of that, so in 48 hours, we have a parking violation notice, parking ticket for that. And then within 72 hours of our first contact is when we tow the vehicle. And we investigate who owns the vehicle, and we try to get a hold of the owner. And so there's some work that's involved in those abandoned or stored vehicle. And that's the way we approach it by policy through the police department. Is there a specific question regarding that?
If it's not moved,
Yeah, so initially we marked the tires. We come back and within 48 hours and it still hadn't moved, we give it a parking violation. And then if it's still not moved, then we come back and tow it.
So from the time that you mark the tire to the time that you tow it, it's 72 hours?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and in between that time, we're diligently trying to determine who owns the vehicle so that we can communicate the infraction to them.
And if this were a trailer and it got pulled into the front yard, that wouldn't violate anything at that point?
No, ma'am, it'd be on private
Under
property at that time.
Current law.
Yes, ma'am.
No, I was going to say the picture shows the trailer, but it would be in the right-of-way of the city, the way it's parked right there.
Correct. Yeah, but once it's in their driveway, it's on their private property.
Right.
All right, I'm gonna go back and get small.
Or really, once it's on their property altogether, right? Because we do not have, one of the things that we wanted to make clear is that we do not have an ordinance that prohibits, cars parked in front yards. And we know that sometimes we get calls of people thinking that we have something that would prohibit somebody from just having cars parked in their front yard.
An operable car parked in the front yard.
Operable,
That's
right?
different, yeah.
So again, we use municipal court. We're using it more and more, and especially as we have, our municipal court has become a court of record. We've been talking to Ruby about the ability to, get orders and injunctions, and so it's all very exciting, and we'll be exploring those as we go through this next year. But historically, we've just used it for repeat violators, and then traditionally also items that it's just too expensive for us to abate. And then how that works is our officers will come to municipal court and actually file the charges, or citations can sometimes be issued by PD for violations that generally code enforcement actually usually handles. That just streamlines the paperwork a little bit. Of course, other big aspect of code enforcement is dealing with substandard structures, dilapidated structures, unsecured, structures with broken windows, holes in the roof, collapsing foundations, all of those beautiful homes out there. We work with primarily using the International Property Maintenance Code, and then of course we have our own city ordinances about the maintenance of structures, and then of course our Building Standards Commission regulations, which basically mimic state law. So this is our process for substandard buildings. First, we have, we receive a lot from citizens. Our police department also forwards a lot of houses to us that they want us to look at. And, sometimes our code enforcement officers just driving around town and see something. First, we send a notice violation to the property owner. This is, hey, we've identified your building as a substandard structure. This doesn't kick off the Building Standards Commission official process yet. But basically, if we get no response or the structure is not repaired, then we begin the Building Standards Commission process. And that begins with a title request to our title company to make sure that we are notifying all of the owners on record. Then we mail those public hearing notices, certified and regular mail. And we have to publish and file those notices in the paper and put them on the actual structure. And that's when you also see, we'll put the notice in addition to those orange tags that you'll see. And at that time, that's when our code enforcement officers do a thorough inspection to compile their staff reports. They compile all those case notes and that inspection record into a staff report and make findings. And then, of course, we publish that through iCompass, through the Texas Open Meetings Act. And then the day of the meeting, code enforcement re-inspects all the structures and then presents their cases to the commission, which we have a really great commission with a lot of experts in the building or the construction field right now. So we're very fortunate. And this is one of the most thankless volunteer jobs, I think, in the entire city, is serving on our Building Standards Commission. And then those orders generally give the property owner 30 days to abate. So you saw our budget earlier. This is kind of what it looks like on a daily basis. So when we contract a property, we issue the contract to the contractor. We actually set the price, and then the property owner or the contractor goes to the property and takes before and after pictures so that to make sure that the property owner hasn't already abated that. So then they come back to us, give us their receipt as well as their before and after pictures. Occasionally, we will reduce the price if the property owner started. The property was halfway mowed. So we renegotiate a reduced price, or sometimes if the contractor comes back and say, this job, y'all way underestimated it, it took us twice as long, sometimes we will add some. And then we, list out the amount billed. And so we have 5 people in the code enforcement checkbook every day. And so this is our way to keep track of that. And basically our $125,000 runs roughly to $10,000 a month. So we are absolutely triaging which properties get abated every month. I could probably spend $125,000 in the first 6 months if we just, abated all the violations that we wanted to abate. So with that, we have some changes that we're hoping that we'll get to implement in this upcoming year, or in next fiscal year. So what we've done already, we've already made some changes just recently. We worked with the Environmental Services Department for the solid waste bulky brush pickup process. So when people put out their brush and bulky without calling it in, the drivers will tag that, and then they'll send those addresses to code enforcement for us to start the violation notice process. Instead, solid waste is going to send out those official postcard notices, and then after 7 days, they will just pick it up and charge people their extra rate of $1.50 a minute for extra pickup or out-of-cycle fees, which is a lot less than if code enforcement has to contract with environmental services to pick up and then charge that administrative fee as well. So we're hoping to really streamline that process. Code enforcement will still continue to process cases on properties without active utility accounts. And then the big change that we would like to implement with the next budget year is move away from our contractors to have an in-house contracting crew. If you go back and look at these fees, you'll see an average mowing is over $100. So we think that with a two-person crew in-house, that we could get a lot more work done. We would still need a contracting budget to contract out things that this two-person crew couldn't do, but as far as light bulk or junk pickup and then all of the mowing, we do think that going to hiring a two-person crew could make us stretch our dollar more. So code enforcement's activity actually really wouldn't change. We would still be issuing contracts, but instead of issuing contracts to outside contractors, we would issue them to the Environmental Services Department, who would manage the two-man crew. And then that work that's performed would still be billed to the property owner in addition to the administrative fee. And then hopefully also next year, we will work with utility billing office to move over water leak investigations to them, because those can take a lot of time too. And basically the ultimate hammer on that is turning off water. So what that in-house contracting crew looks like is 2 full-time employees at a salary of a little less than $38,000 plus benefits. We hope to reduce the contracting time by about 6 days. It would be managed by Environmental Services Department. And again, code enforcement would contract in the same way. And we would also continue to bill the property owners the amount we contracted to them plus administrative fees. So we would set those contract fees, that we have currently now. So if it's less than an acre, this is a set price. If it's over an acre, here's the price for mowing. We would have some one-time cost. So this is all the equipment that Daryl recommends us purchasing for this crew. So a lot of mowers. And then, of course, we would need a truck and a trailer that we would use for existing fleet. Instead of retiring one, we would just keep it on. And so that's kind of an overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Julie, would that still be part of your department? The funding would be part of your department, or is it going to go to Daryl's?
It would go to Daryl's.
Okay.
He would manage everything. We would just contract to him.
Oh, okay. So that would be Daryl's employees.
And one of the pieces, no,
Go ahead.
you go ahead.
So that 125,000 comes out of my budget every year anyways.
Oh, okay.
And so I've been paying for that, I guess, for about the last 5 years. So now that will
Him
stay.
personally.
Yes, me personally. So that will stay. We need to talk about a raise. That will stay in my department. It won't be transferred out to pay for that mowing. So it'll just stay within my department. I spent time with code enforcement going around, looking around. We think we can be more productive than what we're paying the contractors to be, because they've got to work us in between all their other jobs. My sole purpose will be to take care of that. And it'll be in my budget presentation as part of the community appearance department, but underneath the environmental services Department.
Yeah.
Division, media appearance, division under the Environmental Services
And
Department.
part of this too is in response to, I mentioned to the mayor this morning that the most common complaint that I receive from council as it relates to these types of issues is that it takes too long to abate these properties. And so one of the solutions to abate them much quicker is for us to have more direct control over who's doing the abatement. And obviously with us having this two-man crew in-house, we'd have more control. And if Daryl's prior successes and how efficient and productive he runs his crews and his whole staff, we're gonna knock out a bunch of these. And so that's the thought. I mean, ultimately, we recognize that, there's much broader strategies that we need to implement to not have as many properties be dependent on us abating them. But in the meantime, we know we could do more and be quicker at it. And so why not give that a go?
Also, we drive by I guess, probably the only department that drives by every single house every single week. And so what that allows us to do on the brush and bulky is Julie alluded to, is that we'll tag it one week, we'll send out the flyer. And this is just for people who put their brush out more than 1 week prior to us being in their area, or they have junk that's been out and it's not called in, or we're not fixing to be in their area as part of our normal brush pickup. And so when we drive back by 7 days later and it's still there, then we're gonna schedule it to pick it up. There's no having to send them a list and then they send it back to us and us going back and forth. They're gonna get a postcard. If it's still there a week later, we're scheduling it. So like Julie said, we're knocking quite a bit of time off the time that it took before.
I've long argued if you put it at the curb, there's an expectation that it's going to be picked up. And so we just had to figure out how to do the notice part of it. And I think we've streamlined that.
Okay, Julie, but no goats allowed.
I'm not part of animal control. That's not my department.
I'm still back with the not sending the second notice, and I'm a little bothered by it. And I need you to clarify for me, what are the circumstances when you don't send it? I know you said if they've already been a violator, but a violator of what? Because my concern is if somebody violates the weedy lot lien once, that we're just going to make ourselves their yard crew without giving them any notice.
Yes, so it's the section of code that deals with the weedy lots and the junk that, this section, so basically your weeds and your junk. If we find that we are becoming someone's yard crew, that's where we shove them over to municipal court.
Okay.
And try, but the problem is we have to find a property owner to take them to municipal court. And so there's still sometimes we have problems, and we do repeatedly abate properties because we can't find an owner, we can't find a responsible person for that property.
Okay. Because I know I have had at least one person comment to me that they were surprised that, they'd gotten notices the first time and then hadn't gotten more notices and found out that there were quite a few charges against their property. A lot of this is, I think, people that don't live in town. And of course, for the sake of the neighborhood, we want this taken care of.
Well, we just started this past year, so
Okay.
unless they racked up that many in a year, they were receiving, several notices. And we have since, section's bolded on the letter to try and highlight it that, we can abate subsequently this is your only
Okay.
notice.
Great, thank you for
And
clarifying that.
Just to be clear on the weedy lots, that will still operate through code enforcement. They'll simply print a work order each day that'll print at my office, and then we'll put them in line based off where they're at in the city so that it's most productive. We do it in a way that's most productive for us to knock out the most at a time in a day.
Code enforcement operations really won't change much. We will still basically contract to environmental services.
Great.
I looked at that chapter 683 definition of junk vehicles. And as a municipality, we have the ability to provide a more inclusive definition of a junk vehicle. So while it says it can't be self-propelled and has some other, it says it's self-propelled and wrecked, dismantled, or partially dismantled or discarded. That's kind of the state's definition, but it looks like they give us the leeway to say what we want a junked vehicle to be.
I'd be in favor of looking at that.
Yeah.
Is that 683,071?
That's the state's definition. And if you go down under municipal requirements, 683-0711, says an ordinance adopted by a governing body of a municipality may provide for a more inclusive definition of a junked vehicle subject to regulation under this chapter, this subchapter.
We can certainly look at bringing something back that's more inclusive.
Thank you, Mr. Goosh.
That was very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Fulgrim. No more questions for her, so we'll go to the work session, and Mr. Goosh will go through the Charter Review Committee recommendations for us.
Thank you, Mayor Balkan. Members of council, tonight is the workshop where you'll have an opportunity to provide feedback on the recommendations of the Charter Review Committee. We quickly went over the recommendations at a prior meeting, and I want to walk through each of them now that everyone has had time to review what those recommendations are. This is your opportunity to give feedback and to reach consensus among council members about which of those recommendations you would like to see proposed to the voters. I'm not asking for formal action tonight. I'm not asking for any formal decision tonight, but I would like clarity about what you want to see in your propositions. Because then I'll need to go back to work with outside counsel on crafting what that ordinance will look like. We'll need to have it translated into Spanish, and we'll need to bring that back for formal consideration at a later date. So tonight, what we're looking for is consensus on whether or not you want to move forward with proposing these recommended changes. Each of you has a notebook that includes the recommendations from the committee. I just want to very quickly remind you where we are in the process. The committee had previously met through the second half of last year. On December 10th, they delivered those recommendations to you, and here we are today on January 18th, where you have an opportunity to consider what those measures look like. The deadline to order the election is February 18th. So we hope to bring back the recommendation, the actual order for you to consider the first meeting in February. But that, of course, is dependent upon translation timelines and everything. So we will make sure to have that either on the first or second meeting in February. And one way or the other, if you are proposing these to the voters, the election will be on May 7th of 2022. So we're talking about a May timeline for voting. I want to remind everyone that the recommendations are available online on the city's website at www.victoriatx.gov/charter. And I'm saying that again at this meeting because it's not my intention to put all of the language up on the PowerPoint slides tonight. And so for people who are watching at home and aren't seeing the specific language of the proposed measures, I want them to know where they can go to find the specific language. Every one of these propositions and measures is listed on that website for their review and consideration. Some of them are quite large and simply won't fit on PowerPoint slides. So I'm trying to simplify the PowerPoints tonight. I also want to say that our outside counsel, Charlie Zeck, intended to be here tonight, and unfortunately he fell ill and was not able to join us. So I believe I should be able to answer any questions that you have tonight, and if you have questions that are beyond my scope, I will say again, he is the statewide expert, and we will be able to provide you an answer to any question that you might have as we go forward. Within your notebooks, I'm going to start by going through each of the propositions. I'll have the proposition language on the screen, and we will give you an opportunity for feedback. The first two on the list, I'm honestly not expecting much feedback. I welcome any that you may have, but Proposition A is essentially eliminating those provisions that are redundant of state law or duplicative of other areas in the charter or simply unnecessary or could be clarified. These are all cleanup provisions. The measure that follows behind this proposition is very long. It's 11 pages of individual amendments to the charter. If there are any questions about this one, I'm happy to entertain those questions or discussion about any of these proposed changes.
I have a question about language that wasn't addressed.
Okay? In which article and section of the charter?
Let me find it. You use the word, it's a legal term, estop, or
Can you talk into the mic a little better?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Let me find it. It's Article 12, Section 1, the last sentence. No act of any office or employee of the city shall waive compliance on estop of the city from, that's a legal term, right?
Yes.
Wouldn't it be nice if it was just plain English for people that read like bar would work, wouldn't it?
I can understand where you're coming from, and generally speaking, it is my preference to be clear and concise when writing documents that the public might read. However, in this case, and I haven't found exactly where you're referring to, but the word "estopped" is a well-defined term in legal vernacular, and it's something that would be easily interpreted if the need arose. And so typically, that's the time that I would choose to resort to specific legal language.
Where about were you at, because there's no page numbers on this.
You're talking about Article 12, Section,
If you're in the first section where
One?
the entire charter is, it's, yeah, Article 12, Section 1, and in the booklet, it's the very last line on that page with Article 12, Section 1.
Which line is it?
And I just have to say, it's very clear to me. I don't have a problem with it.
as a lawyer.
I had to look up the word. It wasn't a word that was,
Section 12?
that was,
Yes.
and after I looked up the word, I understood what it meant. But I mean, most people read a charter. It'd be nice if they understood it without having to go to a legal dictionary to look up.
I understand.
That's, I mean, if you want to leave it, the world won't end if we leave it, but I just thought it would be nice if it was in plain English.
Here's the reason that I would prefer to leave that with the legal language. What that is saying is it's attempting to establish the fact that the city can continue, will still be required to comply with other notice provisions regardless of any action of any officer or employee. And so that is actually setting a defined standard for city conduct, and I would prefer to leave it with the legal language in case of a challenge on that one point.
That's fine.
That being said, as with anything in the charter, this is your opportunity to propose changes, and if it's the will of the majority of council that we change that language, I think it would be roughly similar in meaning to change the word "estop" to "prohibit." It would not prohibit the city from requiring compliance with these provisions. So if it's your desire to make it more easily understood, and if a majority of council wishes to go that way, we could do that.
I don't have any, I'm fine with the e-stop.
Okay.
I would like to comment on on Article 6, Section 4 that was added, 5 and 6. I like that 5 and 6 was added. Does this mean that we can tell a franchise after we have, now, the agreements that we already have, this would be for future franchise agreements, am I correct?
Again, give me just a second to find where you are. You said
Yeah, I know
Article
it's
4,
hard.
Section 6, and I don't see in Article 4, Section 6, so
It's Article 6,
Article 6, thank you.
Section 14, is it 4 or 14?
It's Section 4. Well, it will now become Section
Right.
1.
Right.
Correct.
Okay.
And it's 5 and 6, I like those. They would apply to future franchise agreements.
Correct.
That's a good thing you put in there, I like that. That means that if we have a friend, we could tell them that we want internet on their poles.
I'm flipping here because I'm not I don't believe that is new language. I believe that
Yeah,
language
I believe that
exists
was
in-
left there.
Yeah, that is
Yeah.
left in the charter. That section is highlighted solely because the numbering changed. The rest of that
That's already in
exists-
the charter?
It
Correct.
exists in the current charter, yes.
So it applies to current ordinance there.
Yes,
So
it
it
does.
applies to current franchise agreements?
Yes, it
Great.
does.
So we don't have to do duplicate polls if.
Good, good.
So it's highlighted because it's going from section 14 to section 1, you said?
From section 4 to section
Oh,
1,
section
because
one,
the
okay.
previous 3 sections are being deleted.
Right.
And again, on the, what you have up on the screen, is this what we can expect on the ballot?
Correct. The language that is on the screen, the proposition language, is what the ballot will look like. When voters go to the polls, that's the language that they will see.
We would, as part of the public education campaign, would have to develop, a voter guide that is quick and easy to work through,
Just explain.
explaining all of what's behind Proposition A, all of what's behind Proposition B. We would have to go through that exercise.
But, but you can't say consequences of voting yes or no, right? Just,
You have to
mean,
be
we-
factual.
Right.
if a no vote is cast on this, it means that.
It will
the
have this
provisions-
effect.
Yeah, the provisions will be unenforceable that are in the charter because they don't comply with state law.
Correct. Correct.
But this language, like on the screen and the next one, is the language that we have to use because, this is ridiculous. The first one says that we're going to delete and amend provisions that are contrary to state law. The second one says we're going to delete and revise things to ensure compliance with state law. That looks like the exact same thing to me.
It is very similar. The first one is redundant or duplicative. The second one is contrary to. All right? And so here in Proposition A, we're talking about provisions that have been superseded by state law or are identical to what is currently in state law and therefore are unnecessary, right? In Proposition B, which I'll get to very soon, I can show you what the difference is, where state law has changed and our charter is now contrary to state law. So they are very similar, yes, but our outside counsel advised us that we needed that to be two separate provisions and couldn't be combined into a single one.
But they still they're not going to tell people within what's written on the ballot. It's not going to give them anything
Correct.
other than that.
Correct. Yes. And I understand that is very difficult with regards to these first two propositions because the measure includes so much language, right? But I see both of these first two propositions as primarily being cleanup in nature. And once we get to the third one, I think this process will get much simpler. All right. Any other questions or comments about Proposition A? And is there clear consensus to include Proposition A on the ordinance we bring back?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Proposition B, and I'll show you, Ms. Scott, the difference between A and B. If you look at the very first paragraph of Measure B, and this is language that impacts Article 1, Section 5, within that section, and it's about halfway down the page, there's a line that says, well, the very first word of the line is accepting, assenting, and adding. The sentence that begins in that line says, "The city council shall have the power by ordinance to fix the boundary limits of the city of Victoria and to provide for the extension of said boundary limits and the annexation of additional territory lying adjacent to the city with or without the consent of the property owners." All right? That was a legal power of the city at the time the charter was adopted. But in very recent years, the state legislature changed the annexation authority of home rule cities and specifically took that power away from cities. If we were to leave that in our charter, it's not duplicative of state law, it is contrary to state law. It is superseded by what is in state law and is therefore inapplicable, it's inoperative in our charter, and that's why it's best to go ahead and take it out. Should a measure like A or B fail, to pass the voters, those sections of our charter would still be inoperable. They would have no utility for our management. This, again, is just a cleanup provision. Are there any other questions about measure or Proposition B?
So the change on the qualifications, the next section, it previously was if you just had to be a resident by election day, a year prior to election day. And now we're changing it to the last filing date?
To the filing date, yes.
And just to clarify too, the reason for A matches this somewhat from the standpoint that we had some things in the charter that track state law, okay? And so you see an example here of state law changed, but our charter still said the same thing state law did. So the reason for A is to take out the things that track state law so that if that changes, our charter's still a good valid document. So and I'm not here as a representative of the committee, even though I was on it, but one of the things we talked about was to try to make our charter more streamlined, that we don't have to go back and make amendments when they change things in state law every couple of years when they come into session. So that was kind of the point, was Proposition A is meant to solve what we're solving in Proposition B, for the future.
I think that's a great explanation, and I appreciate you weighing in on that. In fact, I would even extend that further to say, again, within that Article 1, Section 5, if you see the very first line that is underlined there in the third line of the paragraph, it now says, consistent with the requirements of state law, period. There are several changes throughout the charter that we've done where we've changed language so that it merely says we will be consistent with what state law says, rather than trying to call it out ourselves. And as Mr. Crocker said, that is to try to prevent us from falling out of alignment with state law in the future. Are there any other questions about Proposition B? And is there clear consensus to include Proposition B in the ordinance?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Proposition C is where it's going to get both easier for us to discuss because there's less material, and perhaps maybe more interesting for you to, as you want to get engaged in this. And let me start Proposition C. Well, first let me explain what it is. Proposition C would amend the city charter to provide that all current and future elected officials are ineligible to serve in the same office for a period of 1 year after serving 4 consecutive elective terms in that office. This is a term limits provision. All right. And let me please clarify something that I said at the last meeting. I was asked whether or not this term limits would apply retroactively to sitting council members. And I answered that question incorrectly. I said it would not, that it was the recommendation of the committee that it would apply only going forward. One of the committee members stopped me afterwards and said that was not his recollection of that conversation. I'm persuaded he's correct. His recollection is that it would apply to current and future council members. I'm persuaded that he's correct because that's exactly what the first line says. No current or future elected official shall serve more than 4 terms. And so I want to correct that, and I want to thank that council member for giving me the opportunity to correct what I said at the last meeting. So if Proposition C were to pass, a council member could serve 4 consecutive terms in their seat and then could choose to run for another seat, or could choose to sit out for a year before running for council again. It's not a prohibition on ever running for council again, but it does require that that council member at least take a break or move to a different seat. So for example, if Mr. De La Garza, who is currently a District 1 representative, if he served his 4 terms in his seat, he could then choose to run for a super district, which would be District 5, currently occupied by Dr. Young. And that would not violate the term limits. He would then have 4 additional terms he could serve within that second seat. And then at the end of those 4 terms, he could choose to run for mayor or choose to run for his District 1 seat again. As long as he continues to move to a different seat, he has the opportunity to continue to serve. Does that make sense? Likewise, if you reach the end of your 4 terms and choose to sit out for at least 1 year, then you would have the opportunity to run for the same seat a second time and have 4 more terms available to you. That's the way it's set up to operate.
Did the charter committee look at how that would realistically work, though? Because I'm in a single district, and if I term out, there isn't another position I can run for at that time. I will have to sit out for at least a year.
That's correct.
Or if I wanted to run for the same seat, I would have to sit out for the 3 years until it came open again.
That is correct, yes, and that was part of the discussion. The way that moving from one seat to another would work, for those of you who are in a single-member seat, you would actually essentially run for the super district prior to the expiration of your term, of your final term, right?
It would,
You would have to
it
give up
wouldn't
your
be
seat.
available until a year after the final
So
term.
at the
If-
time
if
you
you-
get elected
if you
for
waited-
your fourth term, one
Yeah.
year later, you could run for the super district. You would still be in the middle of your fourth term, right?
But you would,
No,
And that would
You-
reset the clock at that point so that you could still serve 4 terms.
but
in
you
the
would
super district.
be giving up your seat.
you'd have to give up.
Right, you'd create a
So
vacancy.
you
It
wouldn't
would
run,
create a
Right.
vacancy.
so you wouldn't serve the full 4 terms.
Yeah, you wouldn't term out, you would just have to.
You wouldn't serve the full 4 terms, that's correct.
And then likewise, someone in a super district would not be able to run again for super district or mayor for another 3 years, or they could choose to wait 2 years and run for a single district.
That's correct. There is,
So, I mean, the,
Could run before.
Yeah, and
So
I
it's-
think the intent of the committee was to have people wait.
yes,
so it's only in the case of a vacancy that the 1 year really matters, because it's a guaranteed 1 year at least,
agreed,
unless there's a vacancy.
agreed, yes.
Okay.
Thomas, I have a question on the language on this one.
Sure.
So the language that's being proposed to be in the actual charter is to read no current or future elected official, correct? That's how it would start?
Yes,
So my question is, if this passes and this is 10 years from now, it's kind of irrelevant to the people being involved with this 10 years from now, whether they're current or future.
correct.
So would it make more sense for this to be worded as, no elected official shall serve more than 4 consecutive terms, and have the issue of when it starts being effective be addressed in some other way versus in the charter saying no current or future elected official?
I agree with what you're saying. It would eliminate some clarity issues down the road, so that we wouldn't need to come back in 10 years and amend this to eliminate the
Right, because in
current
10
or
years,
future.
you'd come back in another cleanup, you'd be like, well, we're just going to eliminate current and future and just put no elected official.
Right.
Anyway, just a thought. I mean, clearly the intent is for it to apply to current, but at that point, it's just a matter of when the charter goes into effect. Not so much,
Right.
because in no other part in the charter does it specify
The phrase current
current or future.
The phrase current or future was put in there in order to clarify that it does apply to current council members, but you're
I mean,
correct
that might
down
be a
the road.
small thing, but just something that stood out to me.
It is certainly something that if council has consensus to remove that language, we could remove the language and make it clear through the educational materials that that doesn't change the intent. Or if it's your desire to change the intent, you can certainly have that consensus as well. This is your proposition.
I don't know what everybody's plans may or may not be up here. I don't know if, I want to stay for 20 years. I don't know. This is something that I specifically asked the Charter Review Committee to look at, but it was not my intention that it applied because, and I don't want to call you out, but I don't think it's fair to Ms. Solis, who just all of a sudden becomes, it's my last term. I didn't know that was going to happen. I think the retroactive part I'm not quite on board with. I would be willing to do some type of compromise, elected on or after, and put a date that was somewhere in the past, but not all the way back, 10 years ago, right? But that's my thought on it. And you wouldn't have, you could just say, any elected official or any person elected after some certain date must comply with the term limits, but at least gives some leeway. And I'm not trying to say that any of us up here are special and deserve to serve longer than 4 terms. I'm just saying that I don't think it's fair just to put it in.
Is there a specific date you would recommend?
I haven't discussed this with Ms. Solis, but I mean,
The
go 5
adoption of
terms.
the adoption of the charter, or the new charter, whenever it gets amended and it passes, I guess you could start it then.
But that's going to need some other language too, because, I mean, if you just make it effective with the date of the new charter, it's still going to read, no current or future shall serve for more than 4 consecutive terms, so.
Yes, ma'am. And if it's the desire of council to remove the retroactive effect here, I would recommend that we remove the phrase current and future and make it clear that this is intended to apply starting with the adoption of the new charter.
How about May 1st, or whatever that date was, maybe it's May 2017.
Okay,
Kind of just split it in between.
right, prior to 2017, whatever that election date would be.
Whatever date it was.
Okay?
That gives,
Then, yeah.
you would have 4 terms, but even Ms. Solis, the most tenured of us, could go for 2 more terms after she finished this one, if she really wanted to. But I just want to make it flexible.
She might want to be arguing with you. She might like this a lot.
Yeah, she goes, no, put it in her mouth. But I just want to have that flexibility. And of course, I've always said y'all are the best council I've ever worked with, so.
Especially as mayor.
Yeah. No, I enjoyed it sitting there too. But that would be my suggestion, that we just pick that election date in 2017 as effective, or anybody elected on or after that date.
And take off the current and future elected officials?
I would rework the language to make it clear what that
Okay.
is intended to convey, if that's the consensus of council.
Okay.
And I think that, when the committee looked at this, I can say this, we looked at these different proposals and from the standpoint of you not knowing what anybody's plans are, the committee certainly didn't know what anybody's plans were. Thomas reminded us repeatedly, look, these are just recommendations, and so from that standpoint, these were kind of put out there as neutral. Here's a recommendation to work off of for council to then work through. And so certainly there was no intent there other than to put forward a kind of a neutral policy that council could consider there, so.
And just,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say for clarity of those watching, that each of our terms is 3 years, regardless of the position that we serve in. They're all 3-year terms. So this is a 12, after we get it started, this is a 12-year limitation.
Yes, ma'am. Okay.
I was just going to make a comment real quick to keep in mind that this is something that's going to have to be approved by the voters, right? Something that we're going to have to develop marketing material around. And so think of the messaging that we would have to convey to somebody supporting this change and how that would come across to a resident. To just keep that in mind as you have this conversation, right? Because it's important to keep in mind that perspective as well, right? And so if we change it to be reflective of benefiting existing council, we would just have to be mindful of how that gets communicated to the public who ultimately would vote for this. So just keep that aspect of it in mind.
And those discussions were had, I can tell you, as part of the committee discussion, which is why we went for something that was neutral across the board and could then be reevaluated by council, so.
So is there consensus around the idea of changing this to a 2017 date and bringing that back to council, or bringing that back as a part of the ordinance?
That's okay.
You don't like it as much?
It's just weird. It's just, I don't really have a problem with the concept. I'm just thinking about trying to explain to the citizens why it's just kind of weird. This is 2021, but
If,
2022.
thank you so much. Yes, it's 2020 too.
so is there a possibility that the proposition itself wouldn't pass?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
If the
'cause it
voters choose to vote it
stands
down.
alone. Okay,
That's correct. Then we would not have term limits added to the charter.
okay.
Until the next charter review attempt.
Prior to the next election, and they, that's the way they'd get rid of us.
So it's important to note here, thank you for saying, you said until the next election. I think it's important to note that state law says once you attempt to amend your charter, you can't do it again for 2 years.
Right.
Okay, so it would not be necessarily the next election. The soonest we could bring back a proposal that would be different would be 2 years
And,
later.
and if council's trying to come up with an effective date, it would be much easier to convey to the general public a date that's in the future versus a date that's in the past. And so, for example, you know, is this something that would be effective in '23? Or, you know, just thinking out loud about it, it's just much easier to convey to the public something's going to go into effect in the future versus trying to explain
back.
why the effective
Yeah.
date's retroactive to a past date.
Just a point of clarification on that. We will not have an election in 2023. That'll be our off year.
Right, so we could have another one in '24.
But for, but for example, if the effective date is next year, though, there could probably be some language to where, I'm just thinking out loud.
If it was going to be a date like that, I would just make it May 7th, 2022, elected on or after.
Because it would pass or not
But I was
pass on
just
this.
trying to come up.
But that
with-
restarts the clock, right?
Yes.
I
Right.
was trying to come up with
wrong
a
with that?
compromise
Yeah.
with what the recommendation was from the committee.
Right.
Right.
I certainly agree that it is easier to explain to the public if you don't put a split date in there. If it's either it applies retroactively or it does not.
Yeah.
The split date, I agree, whether it's in the past or the future, will be more difficult to explain to the public.
But it has to become effective upon passage of the law.
That's correct. The charter would become effective immediately. However, you can certainly have provisions that have dates forward or backward, like we're discussing. It's not a
Okay.
problem to implement this as we're discussing. It's just, as Mr. Garza said, it's a matter of educating the public and whether they're going to understand why we're putting a split date in there.
Or one option would simply be to just have, focus on the future piece and make it to where it doesn't
Doesn't have a date?
impact any of the incumbents
Right.
at all.
Right.
In any way, shape, or form. I mean, I get the optics of that, but that wouldn't be uncommon. I mean, there are plenty of charter elections that take place that language stems around not applying until, you know, there's turnover in the position.
And I think the optics of that were specifically what was discussed that led to the current or future, just from the standpoint of, you know, rulemaking for down the road somewhere, but doesn't apply to the city and council, you know, and that's the optics were discussed. I can say coming in with this language or coming up with this language, current or future elected. They're really the reason behind that language was you know, if this is good for the city, then it's good for the city now. Mindset was kind of the discussion, so.
Well, and if we're gonna kind of try and split that, respect for the committee, but try and split that and use the 2017 date as I think about it. I was elected in 15 in a single member, which means that the next year 16 was the super districts, which means that in 17 we didn't have an election at all. And so we wouldn't have to use a May date. It would be better if we said effective January 1, 2017.
Right.
That'd be
You know, that makes-
2018 or whatever that
well,
election was.
Or
I
you
forgot
could simply
did it.
say any member elected after 2017,
Right, right.
period.
And that might, I can't remember when you were elected, Mr. De La Garza. Did you come in 17, which is the date I'm,
You just got reelected.
but when
But
were
I
you,
just got reelected.
when were you first?
Oh, yeah, in special.
16.
Yeah, there was no election in 2017.
Right,
Yeah,
in
but he-
18, not 17.
But he had a term, he finished with Emmett.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I know obviously Mayor Bachnet was elected through a special election. You were as well?
So was I.
Anybody else?
Term was
yet you were.
Oh.
And so, for example, there's a sentence in here that says that years or time of service that an official may serve in filling a full term, an unexpired term, or a partial term of an office to which they were elected shall be counted as a full term towards the above limitation. So under this language, all of you that were voted during a special election, I read that as implying that that counts
That's a term.
That's a term.
as a term.
That does count as a term under this language.
Yeah.
The committee was concerned about whether or not we're defining this in terms of the number of terms you serve or the number of years that you serve. And the committee's preference was to define the term limits in terms of the numbers of
Terms.
of terms that you have served. And so then how do we deal with partial terms? And the answer that the committee came up with was to treat a partial term for which you are elected as a full term. But if you are appointed, and that's a separate amendment that will come later, if you were appointed to your position, then it would not count as a full term.
But Thomas, real quick, I think that only adds to taking an approach of it not applying to this council. Because when they were all elected in that special election, there was no option for appointments, right? So the rationale and the language, the way it's written now, is that depending on when the vacancy occurs, if there's a certain amount of time left in the term, then it's an appointment. And it's only an elected filling of the unexpired term if there's a long enough period left in the term. And I can't remember what that is. Is it 12 months?
180 days is what we're going to get
Right.
for appointments.
It was 180 days, and that's where
So-
the appointment part came in, because
Right.
it's going to be
So
such
my
a
so
small
my
time.
I guess my point is that, for all three of you, you didn't have a choice, right? I mean, it was what it was. I mean, had we had the existing language, I mean, you would probably have had been appointed. Maybe? No, you'd still
was
be
more
far
than
out.
180
Yeah, it would still be far
Y'all
out.
were elected.
Because there's the option in there
Yeah.
of, that the council can take to either appoint or call
Right.
an election. So, with that kind of time
Right.
period, yeah, there would
Well,
probably
either way,
would have been called an election.
either way, it's important you know that that counts as a term for you under this language that's in there now.
So we would have to really change this to effective in 2025 if we wanted it to not apply to the existing council.
Well, I don't think you'd put a date because
No.
people are going to turn over,
Yeah,
You would just
whenever.
Say that
But that's the
beginning
outside.
essentially beginning this year is when we would start the terms.
Right.
We would just
With the
put an
newly
effective
elected
date.
folks beginning this cycle, this stuff begins.
That's right.
What's wrong with that?
Well, and I think we're in a,
I'm fine with that.
and I think we're in a good position to be able to maybe convey some of that, right? Because I think otherwise, I'm trying to figure out how to verbalize it. And maybe I won't say that out loud.
I'm not a fan of the partial term counting, not because I want to run for 4, and I was elected partial, when I was in that seat too. That was not my intent, but my intent was for full terms when I first thought of the idea. So the maximum anybody would stay in any one seat would be 14 years, because if you were, like I ran with 2 years left in that term for District 3.
and then served again.
Yeah. But I don't see anybody doing that long, but I'm all right leaving it like it is. It just wasn't my intent to do it that way. But so y'all want to leave it as any elected official after May 7th, 2022?
Which at that point would simply just be elected official, because if it passes, it would by default go into effect after that date.
Right.
Correct. We would simply begin counting as of May 7th, 2022.
But you would say,
So it would just simply read, no elected official shall serve more than 4 consecutive terms, and the moment this becomes effective would be after it passes, which would be on the 7th.
Right.
So there would be no need to reiterate
If,
the date of May 7th.
That's correct. And that eliminates the confusion in future years of why is this current and future language in the charter? Why is this date in the charter? We would simply clarify through the educational materials that this is intended to start upon adoption of the new charter provision.
That's what it says. If you
That's
just-
not what it currently says, no, but we would have
if
to
you just
amend this
put,
language.
No elected official shall serve more than 4 consecutive terms of office.
That's pretty straightforward.
Then it applies to,
Everyone up here.
correct.
This provision shall not be effective for, or shall not include terms served prior to
Have to
or
put that in there.
time served. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
if that's what you want to do, yeah.
Absolutely. If that's what you want to do, we need to clarify that in there. One way or the other, if you want to make a change, we're going to have to change this specific language and bring it back in the charter, in the ordinance calling the election for final massaging if you want to tweak the language further. But if you tell me what your concept is, I can get the language. That's the easy part. The hard part is, what is the consensus of council? What do you want to see in the charter?
Because I don't like going against the Charter Review Committee either. Did they expect us to have a lot of trouble with this, and did they expect us to reject it, or what was their thought?
It was very clear expectations given to the charter committee and heard from the charter committee many times that this is a recommendation that they're making to council, and that it ultimately is council's decision what gets put on the ballot to the voters. They have no expectation that you're going to leave their words the way it was simply because they were the charter committee that reviewed it. They understand their role in the process.
Thomas reminded us of that many times. And the fact that even after that, it still has to be approved by the voters. So, this is the middle of the process.
The committee recommends, council proposes, but it's the citizens who vote.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely.
Okay, we had an agreement point?
Of leaving it exactly as it is?
Repeat
or
the agreement.
taking out the
Repeat the
partial
changes.
terms?
Repeat the agreement point.
The agreement point is no current, or no elected official shall serve more than 4 consecutive terms of offices, terms that occurred
I
prior to.
wouldn't bother getting hung up on the language. I think the concept is that the term limits would stay the same as proposed here, 4 terms. However, it would not apply to sitting council members, the time already served.
Okay, and I think that the phrase "the sister serve in the same office for a period of 1 year," just would be ineligible. Either take it out of there and put it in a separate sentence, because it's kind of confusing. Because you're saying, okay, no more than 4 term limits, but ineligible to serve. Well, somebody could confuse that to say, well, okay,
Why even have that in there? It doesn't
yeah.
work.
It
Well,
doesn't make
because of the
sense.
scenario of there being a vacancy that takes place, right? I mean, I get that y'all are thinking that it's a 3-year term, but if somebody steps out, right, and there's a turnover because life happens, right, that person would be eligible for appointment or election or be a candidate in a special election if it's after a year.
Ms. Solis, let me confirm that I'm understanding your question correctly. You're asking about the sentence that says terms of service in one office shall not count towards the term of service in another office?
No.
No,
The
the
top
year.
part on the the proposition that says, after no elected officials are ineligible to serve in the same office for a period of 1 year after serving 4 consecutive elected terms in that office. I was
He's talking
thinking-
about the proposition
talking
language.
about
Yeah, the
proposition
proposition,
language.
so if, like he read it, the mayor read it, he said no elected official should serve more than 4 consecutive elected terms in that office. And if you wanted, I mean, I don't know that one sentence in there. I understand what you're saying,
Yes.
that, in case of a vacancy. So that person would be ineligible to be in that position for 1 year.
For 1 year, that's correct. And that is less to do with a vacancy than it is in order to create a clear separation between your first 4 terms in office and the clock starting over again in your second 4 years of 4 terms in office, okay?
And it's picking up the last sentence of the longer language is
Yeah.
the 1-year thing.
That's right. And as Ms. Scott pointed out earlier, The committee understands that because of our staggered terms, that 1 year will probably never be 1 year. It's going to be some differentiation. But the committee wanted there to be a minimum separation time before you got to start serving all over again. And so they believed that the best way to preserve that concept was to put a 1 year gap in there between your first 4 terms and any terms that follow after that.
But if you read the last sentence in the further language, it clearly stipulates that that person would be eligible for reappointment, or for appointment, I should say, after being out for a year.
Would be.
Would be. And
Shall not be eligible for election or appointment to the same office for a period of 1 year from the date of the canvass.
correct, 1 year, right? So if you term out, and then
Right.
13 months later, there's a vacancy because something happened,
You can
then
be
that
one.
person is eligible for reappointment to that same seat after 1 year. Or even eligible to run for that special election that might take place,
Oh, okay.
I
right?
think the 1 year's good.
Right,
I-
but that's
yeah.
why
I was
that's,
thinking it
that's why
wasn't.
that's important, right?
But you could have someone that's been in, terms out, hey, go run, get elected, resign after a month, I'll run.
Well, that's getting too.
That's
Jamie.
the Putin solution, right?
Have you been watching House of Cards?
Yes, I did.
Right.
But, I mean, it prevents something nefarious like that.
And the 1 year, just to clarify, the 1 year only applies to the same office.
Right.
So it doesn't apply to the mayor, it doesn't apply to special district, it doesn't apply to a single member district. It applies to the one office that you're in.
Right.
Same office for a period of 1 year.
Okay.
Seemed to me, I have no problem with the language. The only part that needs to be changed is starting, and it doesn't have to be 2022, effective whenever this passes, no elected official shall, and then everything else is correct. And that would prevent anybody, that would mean from, it starts on that date
Yeah.
and goes forward. And
As I understand the discussion right now, we are coalescing around a potential consensus on keeping the language the way it is, with the exception of clarifying that it does not apply to current council members.
Yeah.
Is there consensus to bring it back that way on the ordinance? Because I can massage the language and make sure it says that if we have consensus about what the concept should be.
Yep.
Okay, we will make that happen. Making myself a note.
we moved on.
All right, that moves us on to Proposition D. Proposition D is the proposition that would allow for appointment if there is less than 180 days remaining on a vacant term, a term where there has been a vacancy created. So if there's less than 180 days, for context, at the time of Mayor McCoy's passing, there was more than 180 days, so even if this provision had been put in place, we could not have appointed. Our current charter says that vacancies must be filled by election, but state law allows for appointment in this limited situation. And so the committee was seeking to allow for additional flexibility that we do not currently have.
I think it's fine.
I agree.
That's
And
fine.
I,
Okay.
and I went back to the term limit one to see whether or not appointing somebody for 2 months would count as a 3-year term, but it does not.
It does not.
Very clearly says it's that partial term to which they were elected.
That was deliberate language, yes, ma'am.
Very good.
All right, so there is consensus to bring back Proposition D as proposed.
Yes.
All right, Proposition E is amending the charter to authorize leases or concessions of parkland being conducted consistent with the requirements of state law. Here's the practical change that's happening if this proposition passes. Currently, our charter says that you cannot sell parkland unless the voters approve that sale. If the property's been dedicated as parkland, it cannot be sold without voter approval. State law also says that. Our charter then goes on to say leases cannot be for more than 20 years. State law does not say that. And so if we change to be consistent with state law, what we are removing is the 20-year limitation on leases. That would allow a long-term lease if a business or a developer wanted to develop a park amenity. The city could then theoretically enter into a 100-year ground lease to allow that property to be used for that purpose. It would be a lease, not a sale, and it would therefore be consistent with state law, even if it was not approved by the voters. But even if this change does pass the voters, you still could not sell dedicated park property without taking that back to a subsequent vote of the citizens. Does that make sense? All right.
That's fine.
Fine, agree.
Moving on then to Proposition F, would amend the city charter to provide that if the mayor and the mayor pro tem are both absent, sick, or unable to perform the duties of office, then the next most senior member of city council shall perform the duties of mayor. This is put in there specifically because of our experience after Mayor McCoy passed, where Mayor Pro Tem Solis filled in admirably for several months, but there were times when she could not make it to a meeting, and we didn't have a process in place for what happens then. So this is merely adding in an additional fail-safe for how do we handle a situation if multiple people are unable to be at the meeting.
And since the entire council will be re-elected altogether, how will we figure out senior? That was a joke.
There is a
But
possibility
there is
for an
a
entire
possibility.
council to be elected. Yes, there is.
Or at least all the single district. I mean, how would you do senior?
That is a
Deal
good-
with it when you get to it.
Yes, I think Mr. Clark will remember this. Conversation can quickly devolve into trying to answer every potential scenario, and this is one of those where we said, when we get to that bridge, we'll cross it.
District 1 got sworn in before District 2 did, so.
We may need to start keeping record of that, yes.
And for the
Rock,
record,
paper,
that,
scissors.
that was not supposed to be based on age when it says senior member. It's supposed to be based on tenure.
Thank you. Tenure, not age. Thank you.
All right.
Also,
Well, that would've been
I will
easier,
point out, for Ms. Scott's benefit, she pointed out a typo in this proposition to me that we will correct. It currently says the most senior city council member present at the meeting to act as mayor, where it should say shall act as mayor. So there will be a slight difference in the materials that are posted online, and that comes back in your ordinance. That is just to correct a typo.
You're saying we don't need to put a coin flip provision in here, right?
That's correct.
Just see if it happens.
If we get to that point, I think that is the solution that would happen. The state law provides for casting of lots in
Right.
various situations. Or we would handle it the same way we're handling it now. Among the four of you, who wants to be appointed to be? We can handle it through Robert's rules. All right? All right, Proposition G, and we're moving along a little more quickly now. Proposition G provides that the mayor pro tem shall be elected by the city council at the first regular city council meeting following each regular city election. What the charter currently says is that the mayor pro tem, once appointed, serves for the remainder of their term in office in their seat, which might mean that it's a one-year appointment as mayor pro tem, or a two-year appointment as mayor pro tem, or a three-year appointment as mayor pro tem, depending on when they get appointed. All right. And so in order to provide clarity and consistency, we're now recommending that that mayor pro tem election happen after each regular city election. Yes, the committee discussed whether special elections should be considered, whether we should take into account the skip year because of our rotation, and the recommendation was that it be elected after each regular city election, which happens 2 out of every 3 years.
What about a runoff?
That would not be a regular election. And so
Got
what
it.
would happen is you would do the appointment of mayor pro tem potentially before that runoff gets decided.
Okay.
Yes.
And we do always canvass the results of the regular election before the next regular city council meeting?
We typically canvass them at the next regular
Okay.
council meeting. It has to be between 3 and 11 days after the election.
Right.
Right. Just want to make sure we don't have a scenario where the canvassing, we would obviously do it, but I don't know if the language should be after the canvassing of the results of the city election as opposed, anyway. If it's a non-issue, it's a non-issue.
I think it's a non-issue.
Okay.
We debated multiple scenarios and ultimately decided that was the cleanest way to make that recommendation. I'm hearing consensus
Yeah.
on Proposition G, all right?
With that, sorry, I don't want to overcomplicate it. But what if it's the mayoral race that goes into a runoff? It's irrelevant? Like, we wouldn't want to have the
mayor
elected
can't
mayor to
be-
be part of the conversation on who's mayor pro tem?
The mayor can't be elected to be.
I
mayor pro
understand that.
tem. Right,
Yeah.
and so that was the decision.
Okay, no part of the conversation.
And then potentially the mayor pro tem that's acting in your scenario would not be the mayor pro tem
Right.
by the end of that meeting, but that's
So what would
the
it,
will of
so
council.
if all three races go into a runoff this May, then the only people talking about mayor pro tem would be the single-member district council members.
No,
because the other members are still
Still
served
serve.
until the runoff.
Thank you. The holdover provision says that they continue to serve.
So it would be smart to appoint somebody who is guaranteed to still serve.
All right,
So
Proposition
moral of the
H.
story, went
What
out
if-
right.
What if the mayor pro tem is, their term expires? I mean,
Say again, I'm sorry.
what if the situation like that, the mayor pro tem is elected and then they don't serve their whole term? Is there another provision somewhere to?
They resign.
Yeah, there's a filling vacancy,
That would be
right?
a vacancy in the mayor pro tem position, and we could potentially fill that through appointment or a future election of mayor pro tem, yes. All right. Proposition H is to provide that the adopted ordinances and code shall be published on the city's website and electronically. Currently, our charter says may be published electronically. Technology has simply reached a point, I think the committee's recommendation is that the citizens expect to be able to access this information electronically, and so we should require that it be published electronically. This would not change our current practice at all. All of this is currently published electronically.
I agree.
So what? So do I.
Next.
Okay. Proposition I would provide that all assistant city attorneys to be appointed and removed by the city attorney. There are a couple of changes in this section. First, the current charter says shall be appointed by the city attorney and confirmed by city council. This would strike the confirmation by city council for assistant city attorneys, not for the city attorney myself. All right. That was perceived to be more consistent with practice statewide. And then secondly, this adds in the phrase "and removed by the city attorney" because there was some ambiguity about how an assistant city attorney could be removed, whether that removal also needs to be confirmed by city council or not. All right.
We haven't been following our charter.
We have been following our charter. I haven't fired any assistant city attorneys since I've been here.
Yet.
Yeah, I was getting ready.
I agree.
That's fine.
All right, seeing consensus on that, we're moving on to.
He was waiting to change the charter. That's why.
Proposition J is clarification of some antiquated language. This also goes into the duties of the city attorney. And the language here, as I say, is antiquated and provides for some ambiguity as well. The new language that's being proposed here would simply say that the city attorney is the attorney for the city of Victoria. It also specifically allows council to hire special counsel for projects where the city attorney may have a conflict. As you remember, you've already done that. Last year, when it came time to renegotiate my employment contract, you reached out to outside counsel. You hired that attorney directly. It did not go through my office. So this is simply modernizing and clarifying some of the language with regards to the duties of my office.
I know this is not the final copy, it's a draft, but on the section of duties of city attorney, he says the city attorney shall, and then the word "and" was struck out, and it says "shall" again, so you got shall twice. Shall prosecute.
Thank you. That's a
in
very good
person.
catch. I will make sure to get that changed.
Okay.
I have one comment, Thomas. I know that we've been very intentional in changing the name of your department to city attorney's office and away from legal department.
That's also a very good catch.
Would
Thank
you want to try and
The
change
city
that here
attorney
too?
and the city attorney's department.
Or city attorney's office.
And
rather
the
than
legal
legal
department.
department. Thank you.
Well, but some of this language is the city attorney shall do this, the city attorney shall do this. Couldn't that be interpreted that you couldn't have anybody else in your department do that, and I know that's not the intention.
If you read the bottom, the last sentence, it says all powers and duties imposed on the city attorney may be exercised by any assistant. So I think it caught it there.
Good job, committee. Thank you.
It's almost like they had an attorney in the group.
Yeah,
There
really.
might have been several attorneys in the room. I think maybe less attorneys than are currently in the room, but there were several attorneys involved in the process. All right, so we're moved on to Proposition K. Based on the appearance that there was consensus on that item, hearing no objection, we're moving on to Proposition K, which would require City Council to adopt an ordinance which provides appropriate signatory authority. The current charter says that all withdrawals from the depository must be signed by the Director of Finance and countersigned by the city manager. We currently don't have a Director of Finance because that title has been changed to Chief Financial Officer, all right? Likewise, I think this charter provision was adopted at a time when paper checks were the norm, and we are moving into an era where electronic EFT payments are the norm. And it's appropriate, I think, to provide for flexibility in how that is, how those funds are authenticated. This does not set that policy out, though. It says that City Council shall adopt that policy so that it can be changed from time to time, but once it is established, it will be firm and can only be changed by City Council. Attempting to strike a balance between flexibility and accountability.
I agree.
Any concerns with that? No. All right. Moving on to Proposition L. This is another cleanup provision. The term qualified voter is used throughout the article that deals with initiative, referendums, and recall, specifically with regards to who must sign petitions. And that term qualified voter can be confusing if it is interpreted to only mean people who are 18 years of age, right? And have not had their ability to vote removed by felonies or some other disability. Here we're saying registered voter. I believe that is consistent with the charter as it is currently intended to be written, because the process of validating those petitions requires that April confirm the voter registration number of each qualified voter. So in my mind, this is a cleanup. It is not a structural or substantive change to this provision.
Thomas, I have a question, and I'm sorry if it
Yes,
was
sir.
discussed with the group. But does it define the format in which this petition is signed?
There's extensive provisions relating to what must be included in the provision, in petitions. yes.
But does it have to be paper? Can it be electronic?
It must be paper and signed with indelible pencil or ink.
Yeah, and that's specified.
And that is specified in the charter, yes. It must be signed on each page by the person circulating the petition. There are numerous requirements, and if a petition were to arise, it is the city secretary's responsibility to review the petition and make sure that it's valid.
Agree.
Okay.
All right, we're in the home stretch now. Proposition M would require city officials to comply with state law regarding conflicts of interest. Our language regarding conflicts of interest was both antiquated, complicated, and potentially problematic, all right? There is state law that governs what conflicts of interest are, and it already prohibits city council members from being engaged in contracts where they have a conflict of interest. What we're changing in this provision, should the voters approve it, is to simply follow state law instead of creating our own very complicated process.
When we make the presentation, would it be appropriate to say that we're not trying to remedy any current violations?
Yes, it is appropriate right now to say there are no known current violations. This is not something that we feel the need to remedy. We're not seeking to add any additional, authority for council members to engage in contracts that might be dodgy or anything. We're intending this to follow state law.
I agree.
All right. And the final recommendation is Proposition N, amending the charter to provide for a process for reconstituting the city council if a quorum of city council has been lost due to multiple deaths or injuries. This is the language in here is very complicated, but the effect of it would be to allow us to reappoint council members in order to create a quorum for the purpose of then ordering an election if we needed to reconstitute the city council. There have been at least a couple of examples in the state of Texas in the time that I've been city attorney here in Victoria, where city councils lost a quorum of their city council, say to a recall election. And if you don't have a quorum of your council, you can't pass an ordinance to call an election to fill those vacant seats. In those situations, they wound up going to courts and having the court order that there be an election to fill those seats. It's a very complicated, very troublesome process. And so this language attempts to create a process to reconstitute council should the worst occur. It is complicated, and we could wordsmith this language. I promise you, we wordsmithed quite a bit in the committee, and we're aware that there are situations that may fall outside of the language here. It's probably not perfect, but it is at least something in our charter that indicates that we have a desire to reconstitute and an ability to.
Thomas, one suggestion I might make just on the language of the proposition itself. That due is D-U-E, by the way, not D-O. But it says due to multiple deaths or injuries. But if you read the actual section, it also accounts for the situation you just called out, which was a recall election. The proposition itself only talks of multiple deaths or injuries. I would suggest that we include or recall election so that it captures all the scenarios in the proposition.
I think that's a good change.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
Thank you. Took me a minute to find where you were talking about. I corrected it on my
Oh.
PowerPoint, didn't I? I corrected it on the PowerPoint. I did not yet correct it in the language.
Well, this was the copy from last time, so
There you go.
I'm sure the new one's good.
But we'll make that type of a correction as well as adding in or recall.
What will be the procedure now? You bring back another amended version to us? for final
Okay,
approval?
so the next step in this process is that I will take your now propositions. They are now going to be propositions, not just recommendations. And Charlie Zeck and I will draft the ordinance the order that calls the election. That will include both the proposition and measure language, and it will be brought back as a very large document for your consideration, hopefully at the next council meeting, but give me some leeway if we can't get it done and translated by the next council meeting. It might be on the February 14th, Valentine's Day? 15th. Missed it by one day. Either of those dates will meet the deadline before the 18th. So we're going to try to get it done by the next meeting, and if we can, we'll bring it back then. That gives us some additional leeway should we get to that meeting and you have questions or further discussion that needs to happen. So that's my preference, but it's going to depend on how quickly we can get this very large document translated.
About that meeting, we could edit or
Yes, sir.
change documents.
Yes, sir. At that meeting, you will have an order for your consideration, and through normal Robert's Rules of Order, you can make amendments to it at that time.
That would be February 1st.
That's the plan, yes.
So this has to be translated, but we have two in-house translators now, right?
We now have two in-house
Twice as
translators.
fast as we get it done.
You can split the document, give half to one, half to the other.
There you go. There you go. Due to the nature of this, we obviously will be seeking a certified translator, and we do now have one on staff.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. Thanks for leading this effort.
Thank you for your consideration of this. This is very, very complicated. And I want to end by again thanking the committee that worked on this. There was significant discussion. You can see how quickly you can devolve into very detailed discussions that have large impacts on our community. And the committee took every one of those discussions seriously. We met until 9 o'clock most nights having those discussions. They took it very seriously, and they brought back a very good product for you to consider.
Yes. I was getting ready to say the same thing. The Charter Review Committee did an excellent job, and appreciate the time they put into it and the thoughtfulness that they put into it. All right. With that, we are going to recess for 5 minutes. And then we'll
Reconvene in executive
reconvene
session.
in executive session.
The city council will recess
You
for
wanna go over
executive
that?
session on 18th day of January 2022 at 7:45 PM.
Okay.
The subject matter of the executive session deliberations is as follows. Executive